Welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today we'll be seeing Louis Buñuel's L'Âge d'Or. Released in 1930, this film was a success, but also quite a scandal. So much of a scandal, in fact, that a number of patrons tore the theater to pieces. We'll be talking about why exactly that sort of thing would have happened and other matters after the film. Today, our guests are Professor Annette Michelson of New York University and Professor Stuart Liebman of Queens College. Enjoy, or at least be intrigued by, L'Âge d'Or.
Yale, Princeton,
Yeah.
I mean, everybody.
We've got to. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. If you've just joined us, we have two guests this evening, or more accurately today, and we'll have a chance to be chatting at length about L'Âge d'Or with them. Let me introduce them to you now. My first guest is Professor Annette Michelson. She's a professor in the graduate program in cinema studies at New York University. She's a distinguished scholar of the theory, practice, and history of the avant-garde cinema with significant specialties in Soviet, American, and French avant-garde, contemporary and historical. In addition to that, she's one of the founders and a co-editor of October, a distinguished magazine of the arts, which covers bases in a number of ways. It's one of the most provocative forums of intellectual exchange. My second guest is Professor Stuart Liebman. He's an associate professor of cinema studies in the Department of Communication Arts and Studies at Queens College. His specialty includes as well the avant-garde, with a significant specialization, is published significantly in the French avant-garde of the 1920s. He also is a scholar of the American avant-garde and has more recently been doing research on the new German cinema, more specifically the cinema of Alexander Kluge.
Very good.
Okay? So, L'Âge d'Or is quite a provocation to all kinds of things. I was thinking, Stuart, you might fill us in a little bit on some of the background to it. I mean, what kind of context did this film come out of, historically and aesthetically?
Well, perhaps it might be best to begin with the history of Buñuel himself.
Okay.
Buñuel was an extremely precocious young man who studied in Spain. Clearly, he responded to the lure of Paris, which was, for many, many decades, of course, something that few ambitious European intellectuals could resist. He came to Paris in 1925, hoping to study music, but being a somewhat wayward character by his own description, he quickly became seduced by that art form that all across Europe throughout the 20s enchanted, delighted, fascinated a whole generation of European intellectuals. In Paris, he had a number of opportunities to learn his trade, most prominently with the then very, very important director, sadly underrated director, Jean Epstein, Franco-Polish origin. And he trained at a small school that Epstein ran in order to staff his own production crews.
Right.
And from that point, he became involved with a number of Epstein productions, including the first independent production that Epstein produced called Mauprat, from the Georges Sand novel. And he met a number of people who had become very, very important to him in his early filmmaking career, including Albert Duverger, who became the cameraman for both Un Chien de Loup, his first film in Paris, as well as L'Âge d'Or, the film that apparently the viewers have just seen. He quarreled with Epstein because of disagreement about the value of Abel Gance, who was by far the leading light in French cinema at the time. And
he of Napoleon.
That's correct.
Right.
He had done Napoleon. He had done Leroux earlier on, which had been very, very important to the French cinema. It had immense resonance throughout Europe, not so much in America, but throughout Europe. It was important to the Soviet Union, for example. Then Napoleon, which had developed a number of new technical devices, including triple screen, the very famous triple screen. And unknown perhaps to Buñuel, Gance still had enough money to become one of Epstein, then an independent film producer's major backers. And for that, Epstein cast Gance's wife as the lead in La Chute de la Maison Usher, The Fall of the House of Usher, which he was shooting. And so Epstein owed him a great deal, and Buñuel, whose evaluation, his estimation of Buñuel was Gance was very different than Epstein's, refused to work with him. At that point, Epstein fired him, and then commenced his career as an independent, somewhat in the margins even of the so-called narrative avant-garde in the 20s, of which Epstein, Gance, Dulac, and L'Herbier were the major figures. It was at that point, and somewhat significantly, Buñuel mentions it in his memoirs, Epstein warned him against becoming too closely associated with the Surrealists, who were then the rabble-rousers among the Parisian avant-garde. And in fact, Buñuel at that time had not had significant contact with that group, headed primarily by Breton. But naturally, when you moved in similar circles, eventually there was contact through, evidently, Man Ray and Aragon, Louis Aragon, who was the kind of adjutant to Breton at the time. And the first film that he made, Un Chien de Loup, an Andalusian dog, he co-made with Salvador Dali, the painter, was so overwhelming to Aragon and Man Ray, who saw it in a private screening, that they brought all their friends and launched Buñuel's career as a so-called surrealist filmmaker. And Buñuel, I feel, was looking for a group to affiliate himself with. The picture is actually a good deal murkier than we are led to believe sometimes by the scholarly accounts. There were a number of surrealist groups throughout the 20s that contested for priority. The best known, the one that has been translated the most, of course, is the group surrounding Breton and his manifestos. But the alternative groups were immensely important, I think, to Buñuel in a way that has never been seriously acknowledged. For example, the group surrounding Georges Bataille, which had many, many figures with whom Dali and Buñuel were very intimately linked personally.
If we might shift just for a second from the personalities to the kind of more general aesthetic background. It's certainly unfair to turn to you, Annette, and say, in 10 words or less, and I'll give you a lot more than that, let's refamiliarize ourselves with what some of the major notions of surrealism were. I mean, it's one of those words that now in our culture has been so deprived of the specificity of its meaning. I mean, people just say, oh, well, that's surrealist, and they don't really know what they're saying frequently. It refers to just a kind of large realm of odd experience in common parlance among people. Let's try to recover, if you would help me recover what it really meant in some ways, please.
Well, first of all, I think one should realize that when Buñuel arrives in Paris, he arrives very, very soon after the publication of the first Surrealist Manifesto. That is to say, he arrives really at the moment of the kind of effervescence of Surrealism, as conceived and directed by its founder, Breton. And I think one should not forget that these were young men who had grown up during the period, who had come to maturity during the First World War. Breton, in fact, had done his military service. They were also very aware that after the First World War, Europe, and in particular France, was by no means ready to relinquish the kinds of imperial designs which had dominated the politics of the 19th century. So that when Breton writes the first manifesto, he is aware that the French have in fact carried out the first civilian bombing in the War of the Rifts, carried on in North Africa. Therefore, surrealism has an impulse of resistance to imperial domination, which one sees spread throughout its literature. That is to say, it is not simply a subversive, but it has its roots in a kind of quasi-pacifist and somewhat revolutionary impulse. That's most important. Secondly, it recognizes, I think, with a kind of acuity which is confirmed by the visions of their contemporaries in other places,
right.
School of Frankfurt, for example, that the war and the current impasse on many levels of Western society in general is the product of rationality, is in a sense the end product of a certain hyperbolic rationality. And therefore, surrealism is attempting really to reestablish the primacy of a certain respect for impulse and that which is not subject to the rational integration into a totally mechanized and industrial society. Therefore, the emphasis on spontaneity, on automatic writing, on the state of dream, of oniric experiences, and the emphasis, of course, on that one domain, which is the domain of freedom by excellence, which is that of sexuality and eroticism.
Right. And that perhaps brings us to the point of why this film, one of the centers of why this film was viewed so scandalously. Before we came on together, I had pointed out to our audience that in fact this led to the theater being torn apart by a number of factions of the audience. Now, there were certain claims made that it was a technically crude film, that is, it violated this standard of sophistication, etc. But I don't think that's the real reason at all. I think you've already touched on it, that this film opens up areas of eroticism not portrayed, or certainly ever portrayed in this manner before in the cinema. How does it go about doing that, and what is it really doing when it's doing that? I mean, either of you? I mean, Renette?
Oh yes, I mean it's very much at the center of the film, and not only at the center of what we see, but it's very determinant of the way in which we see it. Because, for example, in the film to begin with is a film in which essentially the action breaks off at many points. It's a film which is constituted, one could say, almost of a series of interrupted actions. The narrative of the very first part, the kind of long hike over the island, is somehow interrupted. These are characters who are introduced at the very beginning of the film. We never see them again. The lovers are constantly being torn away from each other. So that I think it is fair to say that the film, in its form, actually, takes on the aspect of a kind of coitus interruptus.
Right.
That is, narrative expectations are constantly being frustrated, just as the sexual passion of the lovers at its center is being frustrated. That's one thing. And I'd like to point to one other aspect or one other parameter of the film, which I think is extremely important. And that takes place in the sequence which involves the founding of the city of Rome, during which, as you remember, we hear while the founding ceremony is actually being carried out. Screams which seem to come from off-screen space, somewhere else. And they're obviously the screams of a woman in travail. And when the camera shifts, when there's a shift and we see what is happening, we discover, of course, that this woman is part of a couple who are making love in the mud, right? And so, in a sense, what's interesting about that, apart from what we see, is the fact that we as spectators have been led to believe that there is a woman being abused, perhaps murdered,
Right.
attacked.
Right.
And what does that mean? It essentially means that we are put in the position of the child witnessing the erotic encounter of his parents in the classic Freudian definition of the primal scene. And it is not until the camera has shifted, that is to say, until we have been able to get a cognitive grasp of the whole scene and sequence, as it were, that we realize what is happening. That is to say, that we gain knowledge of the fact that this is not a scene of physical violence, but one rather of an erotic encounter. So what I want to say then is that the form of the film is that of a kind of coitus interruptus, and that we as spectators are introduced to the film in a position which is that of the child witnessing its parents in the primal scene.
This film certainly made a lot of people mad, and it's interesting that in doing so it made a lot of people mad. They didn't claim necessarily it's eroticism, that may be under it, but it had a lot of opponents on political grounds.
Yes, as Annette mentioned, the political impulse in surrealism is something that often tends to get underrated today, especially in the United States. I think there's been a good deal of research in France recently that has restored that political dimension. A number of memoirs have reconfirmed that dimension. Briefly, in passing, they had a very long and tempestuous relationship with the fledgling Communist Party in France, and a number of the satellite political organizations around the Communist Party were expelled from the Communist Party. Breton himself, over a number of years, pursued Trotsky ultimately to Mexico in the late 30s, and that is something that one cannot forget, given the particular character of the group that attacked the film and was responsible for its banning shortly after its release in 1930 in Paris.
If I interrupt you just for a second, Stuart, it might be interesting just to talk about, not even so much to talk about the political folly of World War I, but today it's difficult, I think, for some of us to recover initially the carnage of that war. One of the exercises I occasionally use in class to try to drive that home, I think it makes a point, is that I'll have all my male students count to 5. And I'll say every 5th male student can now leave the room, because if you had been a student in 1913 in France or England of your class, of your generation, all of you would be dead. Every 5th student in the male student would be dead, and that's not even to talk about the 3rd and the 4th student, shall we say, and what emotional or physical damage the war had done to them. So the context we're talking about is so cataclysmic, and that's one of the things that strikes me is not recovered frequently in a discussion of surrealism, how much the violence they're doing aesthetically is a response to the violence they've just seen occur to their generation and to those that surrounded them.
Was, I think, Annette so trenchantly remarked, the bottom line, as it were, was to put rationality in its entirety into question. That paralleled a number of efforts across Europe at the time to do so from very different theoretical perspectives. The stress in surrealism was less on elaborate social diagnosis, as you might find in the critical school in Frankfurt, but rather on the possible therapeutic, complementary, suppressed aspects of human consciousness and spirit, very broadly. And those have to do with eroticism, with the dream, with madness, with various kinds of exotic religious practices. And throughout the 20s, if you follow their magazine, La Révolution Surréaliste, the Surrealist Revolution, and its successor publications, you find a series of experiments, if you will, that almost couched in scientific terms, ironically, but a series of experiments with different kinds of conceptual orders that might pose a viable alternative to the rationality that had been so discredited by the war.
And using different models, I suppose, for those. I mean, obviously, I guess we can think of the dream as one model, an erotic encounter, and the change in the consciousness rendered as such as another model.
But there is, I think, another model which one might propose as part of the therapy which Stuart mentioned, and that is shock therapy.
Yeah.
Because I think that the very violent reaction to the film was, in a sense, if not predictable, in a certain sense, very understandable and very justifiable. That is to say, the positioning of the spectator in the way that I have just described, I think, in a way, helps us to understand why that reaction was so violent. Another, for example, which is instantiated in the celebrated scene on the toilet. I mean, here are two separated lovers having erotic fantasies, and these fantasies, they have made love in the mud. And these fantasies occur, you know, in the bathroom, on the toilet, in that place, you know, which is as far from the romanticized, idealized notion of love that we generally are familiar with, and particularly in movies. And not only that, but when the chain is pulled, the screen is flooded, totally flooded and occupied by excrement. That is to say, the audience is confronted with a screen full of excrement, a sequence which I always feel should have been very dear to Georges Bataille. And that is to say, what is involved in both the eroticism and in what one might call the politics of eroticism is a kind of desublimation process, which is radical, and which is, again, I think, a form of shock therapy, if you like.
Yeah. I was wondering, this is one of the first sound films in France, and so it's part of that whole sound revolution. As many people know, there was a great debate, I mean, across Europe at that time about what the proper and significant uses of sound may be. This is, one might say, an odd film to be one of the first sound films. Some of us would say it's appropriate that it's one of the first sound films. How does the uses of the soundtrack, Stuart, connect with these strategies of shock therapy, these strategies of implicating the spectator? I mean, and that's already mentioned the cry of the woman in the mud, but what are some of the other things going on there?
Well, actually, according to Buñuel, and I think the records would more or less bear him out, L'Âge d'Or, which was financed, by the way, and I think we ought to get this in, by the very famous Comte de Noailles, who was a major patron of the avant-garde in France, particularly the Surrealists, who had also simultaneously, more or less, funded Jean Cocteau's film that became Le Sang d'un Poète, the blood of a poet. In any case, it was one of the first experiments with sound. The French industry initially, like most industries across the world, was wary. Significantly, Epstein was very, very positive, as was Gans. The first studios were set up very, very late, in part in France, because France did not own the sound processes. These had to be imported from Germany and the United States. And one characteristic of, general characteristic of these early French films is a kind of somewhat malevolent wit in the use of sound. Renoir's first sound film, made I think the same year or perhaps slightly before, was called En Pourge Bébé, and in it there was the sound of a flushing toilet. And for this, Renoir was soundly criticized, and for him it was simply an experiment to see what sound level could be sustained by this equipment. You have this in the flushing of the toilet, the sudden flushing of the toilet, which he very carefully specifies in his script, must link up with the images in such a way as to suggest a simultaneous process. What's characteristic of the film is a very powerful splitting of sound and image, and the use of silence in a, by then, sound medium. You have the most famous, perhaps, sequence is when the heroine of the movie, who was played by a fairly unknown French actress named Lia Lee, she is waiting and dreaming about her lover, Gaston Meudot, who is still in captivity. And she sits at a mirror. It's one of the most beautiful images in the film, I think. And in the mirror you see she's sitting in a room, of course, and in the mirror you see reflections of clouds which have been somehow superimposed. And the wind blows through her hair through a source, from a source that you cannot identify easily. And you hear the sound of cowbells, which ultimately link up to the space in which her lover, Gaston Meudot, is being led.
I think also one of the things that's important about surrealism in film is their entire attitude toward not only dialogue but language and text in general. Because, you know, it took a long time for the surrealists, well, it took a few years, let's say, to get that generous funding from the Vicomte de Noailles, so that for a long time they felt that their films were being made by the German expressionists and by the Soviets. Potemkin they saw as the first real surrealist film. But when they came to make films of their own, they made a particular use of film titles in the forms of puns and rather enigmatic and kind of riddle-like texts. And when they come to make their first sound film, they are still using the form of the pun, both visual and in sound, so that the bandaged finger of the Alice is actually a pun on a very particular kind of sexual erotic idiom. So that's, I think, important among the surrealists. They introduce not only sound, but they carry over from their silent films and from the whole repertory of, by that time, established convention in surrealist painting, surrealist art generally, a tradition of play with language and with sound.
This is this Buñuel's last purely surrealist film? And everybody considers him a surrealist throughout his career in this aspect and all, but I mean, one of the great things about this film was that there were no restrictions put upon him. And is this the end point in some way, or how would you? Well,
I think it's without question that he made this film very much under the auspices of the surrealist group. There is in fact a manifesto, although they had nothing to do with the creation of the scenario that I'm aware of. There was a manifesto in its defense. It became a hot political issue to which they contributed their own, what is it, oil in the fire or what have you. And a number of them participated in the making of the film, including Jacques and Pierre Prévert, the poets, and Max Ernst plays the lead bandit who reports to the rest of them that the Mallorcans have come, the Mallorcan bishops. So that in many, many obvious ways it's a work that was validated and under the wing of the surrealists. He continued to work with people on the periphery of the group, including Pierre Unique, in his next film, which he made in Spain in 19...
But I think there is one thing that one can say about his relationship to surrealism as his career kind of continues. And that is that essentially what happens to surrealism in Buñuel, or through Buñuel, reflects what happens to surrealism generally. That is to say, the relationship is never totally broken. It's extended and modified and varied. It's never totally broken. But he no longer, I think, as he goes on in his career, and it's not simply that he continues, but the history of film evolves and all kinds of possibilities are open to him. I think what happens is that he merges in a kind of Magritte-like continuum into the history of film itself. And so that a lot of the impulses and a lot of the iconographic elements of surrealism are absorbed into a continued dialogue with the form of narrative.
Continued dialogue is a good place for us to stop because we don't have any more time today. If you'd like more information about this film series or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate at the College of Staten Island, please send us a self-addressed stamped envelope to the following address: Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me repeat that address for you, okay? That's Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York. I hope that our discussion here leads you to discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today, we'll be seeing Sergei Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky. Produced in 1938, this film is a nationalistic epic of visual magnificence that includes a score by Sergei Prokofiev. Eisenstein himself called it a fugue on the theme of patriotism. In fact, this film raises a host of topics about the relationship between art and politics, between image and sound, and between history and the uses of cinema. We'll be returning to these topics after our screening. Tonight, our guests are going to be Professor Jay Leida of New York University and Professor Virginia Brooks of Brooklyn College. Enjoy Alexander Nevsky. Talking and welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed Alexander Nevsky. We have with us tonight two guests. I'd like to introduce them to you right now. We have first Professor Jay Leida of New York University. Professor Leida is the author of, among many scholarly works, two that pertain especially to us tonight. First of all, Kino, a history of the Russian and Soviet cinema from its origins to the present. And second of all, Eisenstein at Work, a book that chronicles the working methods of Sergei Eisenstein. In addition to being a scholar and a teacher and an author, Professor Leida has the distinction of having studied with and then worked with Sergei Eisenstein. I'm sure he'll be willing to share a great deal of that with us tonight. My second guest tonight is Professor Virginia Brooks of Brooklyn College. At Brooklyn College, she's in the film department, where she heads the production program. In addition to her teaching duties in production, Virginia has special interest in how dance is filmed. In addition to that, and one of the reasons we have her with us tonight, she has a specialty in Soviet and Eastern European cinema and has taught several courses on that for us at Brooklyn College. I thought we might start this evening, Jay, by talking about, first of all, how you ended up in the Soviet Union, and then second of all, from there, what this film meant to Eisenstein himself. I mean, how did he get involved in this film project?
Can we take those two questions apart?
Sure. You're doing it
they don't join very well.
Okay, then start with the first.
There was nothing accidental about my going to the Moscow Institute.
Okay.
It was all deliberate, very deliberately planned. I even made a film in order to get in.
Okay. Were you inspired to go there by seeing an Eisenstein film?
Oh, probably. And it was the only film school in the world then.
Okay.
And when I heard that Eisenstein was teaching the director's course, nothing could chain me down.
Okay, and so you got from where?
Oh, I used people, I pulled strings, just everything. And made a film of my own, which I'm not sorry I made,
Yeah.
but the main motive for it was to get me in, so it accomplished its purpose.
Yeah, okay. And then you started...
The people who looked at it there all had different reasons for liking it. You could detect that because they all assumed that it was an imitation of their methods.
Okay.
So Vertov liked it for one reason, Eisenstein liked it for another reason, and so on.
Okay, flattery is the best way to get into...
I didn't say a word.
Okay. Oh, so you ended up not only studying with Eisenstein, but working with him as well.
Yes. He hadn't made a film for a long time, and people were complaining bitterly about that. So finally he was driven to make a film, and make it in a hurry, too. But he was, I think, the most efficient film director in the Soviet Union. He could always surprise the film factory that he was working in by turning in a film. Nevsky, for example, was turned in 4 months before its deadline.
4 months before its deadline, but it looks like a picture with extraordinary potential production problems. I mean, look, I mean,
all the problems in each film were solved in advance and glued in advance to the thing that he wanted to be challenged within that film, within that subject. No film of his looks like any other film of his.
Okay, but at the same time, we all know we're watching an Eisenstein film. I mean, there's a certain mark to him.
Well, I wonder sometimes whether you would.
Okay.
Because there are lots of imitation Eisenstein films.
True enough, but I think there's still a sense that there's a sense of movement about some of the things he does, the way he stages things that are pretty distinctive. I might want to ask Virginia about.
If I could watch him taking that film, I could be sure, but not if it were just on the screen.
Okay. Well, I just want to ask Virginia for a second about that sense of how distinctive it is when you see people move in Eisenstein. I mean, do you think, am I right or am I wrong or, what?
Well, the distinctive characteristic of this and the films before are that there is no camera movement as such, that the main movement that you see is movement that has been choreographed, in fact, by the subjects. And very often, not even that. They're stationary tableaus between which the cuts are made. So that the sense of depth that you get is realized in a different way, in terms of the different planes that he has people stationed at.
This distinction between the several films was part of his trouble, because in his early films they always wanted, make another Potemkin, make another Potemkin.
Okay.
Well, that wasn't his plan for his life and career.
So
he had lots of things he wanted to work with and experiment with.
Okay. Now, how did this particular film that we've just seen come about? I mean, how did he get involved in this project itself?
He was given two figures familiar to the public in the Soviet Union. Either Alexander Nevsky, who was a saint,
okay,
or Ivan Susanin, who was the hero in Glinka's opera. And he said, "Oh, there's no question about it. I want to take Nevsky because we know nothing about him."
Okay, so, but for a Russian audience, when this film was produced and came out, would this be the equivalent, oh, say, of knowing a legendary character like American children knew Davy Crockett as a great frontiersman or something of that sort?
They might have known something about Ivan Susanin, but as I said, there was nothing known about Alexander Nevsky except his sainthood.
Okay, so essentially,
and his essential patriotism. And so this was bound to be a patriotic film.
Okay.
But the figure in it was rather amorphous at certain points.
So he was given a blank slate in that way to fill it in the ways.
Yes, he gave himself the blank slate.
Oh, okay, okay. That's a very interesting sort of thing to have. What was the political situation in the Soviet Union at that time? I mean, were there a lot of politics? I mean, obviously it's a state-run film industry, but what kind of problems would he have run into? Do you?
Well, I mean, there was a specific request from the government that he make this film at this time.
Well, and he had lots of other problems too. For one thing, this film was made in 1938.
Okay.
He had been making films since 1925, but this was his first completed and distributed, shown publicly, sound film.
Okay.
In between, there were plenty of projects, but they were all rejected or for one reason or another. So actually a history of his projects belongs with the history of his films.
Okay. So
and they were always sound, of course. But this was the first time the sound became public sound.
Okay. He had made statements along with Pudovkin, the other director, and Alexandrov about what the proper uses of sound would be.
Well, you'll find that this film contradicts them completely. Contradicts that manifesto anyway on sound.
Let's stop for a second, and just since I don't think a lot of our viewers know that manifesto.
Well, let me describe it.
Okay.
One of its main aims was to persuade people to regard the image and the track as not necessarily synchronized.
Okay.
While one of the problems in Nevsky was to synchronize everything precisely.
Okay. So one of the things, at least let's go back to the manifesto for a second.
Or rather, to make it a little more precise, to synchronize its emotions with its music.
Okay.
And its sound.
Right. But one of the things that they had feared initially was that the sound film was going to turn into canned theater. That is, that the distinctive cinematic qualities...
And we know that that did happen.
Yes, and that's why Hollywood...
It happened in the Soviet Union, too.
Partly because the new cameras and the restrictions on them were so much larger, and they didn't have whatever mobility they had finally achieved in the silent films toward the end. They couldn't... everything was much heavier.
Yeah.
And so it was harder to move around. But wouldn't you say that there was a structure to this in terms of the divisions between the sort of singing sections as opposed to the spoken word? In other words, there are divisions which divided in terms of the romantic song, the patriotic song, and they're sort of led in little...
Well, Prokofiev knew his job very well.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there are references to other Prokofiev pieces, as there are in almost every Prokofiev piece, but they come in sort of almost as if they're lead-ins to a particular section, that there's this kind of music that's going to tell you that they're going to now march off to war. And then there's this
No,
kind
the oratorio that it was turned into
Right.
afterwards, just the music, shows that there was an oratorio base.
Design.
Not to mention an opera base
Sure.
also.
Okay. Now, how did...
Because opera and oratorio both wanted emotions to coincide with the music.
Right.
Okay. How did Prokofiev get involved in this? Did Eisenstein and Prokofiev know one another before this and want to collaborate, or was this one of those moments in which they said, well, we've got a great composer and we've got a great director, let's throw them together and see what comes out of that?
Yes, they were thrown together.
Okay. Well, it certainly turned out to be one of the happiest throwings together in the history of cinema. But an interesting...
And two more films after Nevsky were also scored by Prokofiev, but they were not completed.
Oh, okay. Which were those, Jay?
Fergana Canal
Okay.
was to be another big slabs of history, which started with the Mexican film, slabs of history that contrasted as well as melted into each other.
Okay.
Then Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible,
Okay.
of which we know only the first part as being genuinely his. The second part is mangled,
And
the third part was destroyed.
okay, so this is the
But those were to have their own styles too.
Okay. Now, the interesting thing about the fact we're using the word operatic is that I think in the 20th century, one of the ways in which storytelling film has developed is for a lot of people, it's been in opposition to opera, because in the 20th century, opera is perceived by many people as highbrow culture. Whatever its origins may be, in the 19th century, it's perceived by a wide popular audience as something, to be avoided. Gee, I'd much rather go to the movies than have to go sit through an opera of some way. I've heard that phrase many a time from many a person. But for Eisenstein, I think you were saying this just before the show, Jay, saying a film was operatic was not any sense a slur on it.
Not for him.
Well, okay.
But it was a word that meant opprobrium of some sort among critics.
Yeah.
It wasn't pure film.
Oh, okay. And of
Well,
course,
there is this sense of tableaus which occur in many cases in this film.
And even more in Ivan the Terrible.
Exactly, where they're set up with these incredible compositions which are beautiful to behold, but they're also very static for a period of time, which is not the way we think of films as going, unless you take into account the movement that results from cutting between these static shots, which is considerable.
Well, by that time, he had decided that montage as an element doesn't necessarily force you to have montage between the pieces, but even within each piece.
right.
And not just in the case of movement either, but sometimes two static things follow each other, almost like a kaleidoscope.
Well, and you have something
And
coming,
that provides the montage.
and you have something coming in the negative space of the previous shot, so that
That's
your
right.
eye is drawn to a particular section of the frame by the cut.
So that is not a deviation from his montage principles at all.
It's only an expansion of it into other realms.
Well, a burrowing into it, really.
Yeah, okay. But the film is really magnificent for its rhythms, because we do have that sense of tableau, the sense of the depth of field and the definition of things, one plane after another, and then of course we come to the climactic battle on the ice, in which, even though, I think you were saying, isn't there just one camera movement that you were finding in the battle, the ice itself?
No, it's afterwards. It's after the battles are completely over, and in fact, all the movement in the battle has been provided by the movement of the subjects. But if you'd like to talk about the battle first, I'll talk about the aftermath afterwards.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the battle. First of all, I think some of our audience might be interested to know this is not only a very famous sequence in film history, but one that's been extraordinarily influential. So that Henry IV, the film made by Lawrence Fifth. Sorry. English history was so long ago.
And so was Shakespeare.
He's closer. But the Henry V, excuse me, that Laurence Olivier made during World War II.
I don't think he would possibly have made that kind of film without Nevsky.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think we can push it as far
And then
forward?
people began to imitate Henry V.
Yes.
Exactly.
Do you think we can push it as far forward as something like Apocalypse Now? And there's of course, in that film, there's a very famous
wouldn't
helicopter. You wouldn't dare do
wouldn't
that?
touch it.
Okay. Well, we won't touch it. Let's just go back.
Not with the Ride of the Valkyries for the helicopters.
But Eisenstein had just staged a Wagner opera. He staged one right after making this film, didn't he?
Very soon after, yes.
Yes. And one of the things you were talking about in montage is that there is this movement in Eisenstein's thinking from a notion of montage as something that develops reflex in an audience, that generates reflex, to this movement towards synesthesia, where he can suggest one sense through using another's in another sense, and that comes from
It's
Wagner.
true. He was always very aware that all the senses have to be appealed to in some way.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the battle on the ice, Virginia.
In July.
Yeah, in July. Well, I think it should be pointed out. Why don't you talk about that just for a moment? Just the production fact that's, I think, interesting.
Well, I think that's
An
really...
efficiency fact.
Yes,
Efficiency
exactly. I was
fact.
going to say, I'm sure that Professor Leiden has a better conception of what was going on there, but the whole production problems of doing it in the middle of the summer in the extraordinary heat and having to provide artificial snow and all of that sort of thing. Must
I have an idea. I wouldn't want to
extraordinary.
have one of those Teutonic helmets on in the midst of July in the outskirts of Moscow.
I'm sure they didn't appreciate it either.
Yes, yes, but Sergei certainly, Eisenstein certainly
But
got what
they
he
gave
wanted.
him what he wanted.
Yes, and we have that. Well, back to what makes that sequence so distinctive and so influential as we've tried to chronicle.
Well, it's full of so many different techniques to provide that sense of incredible action with a large number of people without letting you completely lose track of who's fighting whom,
Yeah.
where the battle is going on. I mean, they have distinctive costumes so that you can keep track of them that way, but it's an extraordinary melee, and it's being done in such a way that you have a sense of, aside from the fact that you're being told about the wedge and the various tactical
Oh, you do
methods.
know who is who,
You do
which
know,
is not
yeah.
always true of battle.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's quite amazing from that standpoint, for me at least. I'm always interested when I can keep track of the combatants and who's doing what.
Let me stop just for a second. It is true that Eisenstein controlled all aspects of production. I mean, certainly he had a marvelously
Yes,
gifted
he
crew.
was a wonderful producer.
Okay. So,
And at one time, they made some use of him as a producer. They put him in charge of the Mosfilm studio,
okay.
and the films that were turned out there by normally qualified people are usually their best films.
Now, so for example, with regard to this whole issue of the costumes, and nobody forgets the Teutonic Knights. I mean, you see one or two images of them, and whatever else you may think of the film, you'll never forget them. Now, he did the costume sketches himself for all of these.
And the helmets.
And the helmets.
The
and
claw and the hand.
The claw and the hand. Well, I think most of the people who are watching this, for one reason or another, have probably seen Star Wars, and they might be interested to know where a lot of this stuff came from. This is not to demean George Lucas, who's very smart and knows who knows the people he's borrowing from in film.
I'm a proponent of plagiarism.
Yes.
I think that without plagiarism, the film would not have speeded up so wonderfully in its history.
Well, at least shoulders to stand on.
Well,
if
yes.
not actual plagiarism.
And
I don't mind imitation either.
Was it Faulkner who also said that mediocre artists borrow, great artists steal mercilessly? So well, let's get back to the battle. We talked about the costumes and that sense, but there's an incredible sense of movement there, and we don't have a moving camera. I mean, how does that work?
You don't really need it. I mean, consider the number of people who are moving on the screen, and also in the close-ups, the amount of movement. If you notice, there's a lot of very repetitious movement in those close-ups. You'll get somebody hacking somebody apart, and they do it with a vengeance for quite a period of time. Some of those shots are very long. But there's also things you can see going on behind that close person doing the thing, which gives you a sense
And
of...
just imagine that everything was worked out on paper, too.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
he
so
knew
he-
exactly what he was looking for when he went to each
So
segment.
in that way, I mean, we talk about similarities among some directors. There's a very popular story about anyone who saw Hitchcock on a set who looked profoundly bored simply for the reason that the film, in one sense for him, had already been made because he had planned every detail,
I know
every
this
shot.
is digressing, but have you ever seen a Hitchcock sketch for a scene? I haven't.
Oh. I'm trying to think if I've seen a picture of a storyboard.
A very good
storyboard
friend of
sequence.
mine was his assistant for some time, and he had never seen any of the sketches either.
So perhaps lurking away somewhere are the sketches.
Apocryphal.
No, he
now.
had put it together in his mind. It didn't have to be on paper, perhaps.
Okay, but it's in that sense it's utterly pre-planned. I mean, there's no.
But Eisenstein was taking no chances. He put it on paper because in some sequences, he wanted the assistant director to be working on that sequence while he was working on another sequence. So he would just hand him his whole concept and plan for the sequence.
Okay.
In this case, it was Dmitry Vassiliev,
Okay.
who was also a very efficient assistant director who had turned in very commendable jobs of efficiency. So they got along very well.
Okay. Well, now we were going to go back to after the ice
The
sequence, and the fact that we get all of this motion with no moving camera during the ice sequence, and then we get the moving camera. When is it?
Well, there's a period in which they're showing you all of the bodies strewn around, and there's a cut to a raven on a body, and
Right.
then there's a cut to the two romantic heroes, I guess you might want to call them.
Such as they are.
Rivals and heroes. And they're talking about the fact that they're both still alive. And then the women are seen coming, actually they've already been cut to before that, coming across the horizon in a very deep shot from the horizon forward, carrying torches and looking
And
over
built
the
for a
people.
mezzo-soprano.
Right. And as their singing women approach, they look very concentratedly into the camera and say, listen to who's singing and who's coming toward us. At which point, there is the one camera move in the film, in which the camera tracks backward over this scene, but they're not in the shot, which is very interesting to me, because normally if you'd been given that kind of setup for a point of view shot, you'd expect to, or a subjective shot or something, you'd expect to at least see the people, or if it were going to be a backtrack. If you were going to say it was a subjective shot, the shot would go away from them as you watched what they were looking at. Instead, it's going the opposite way. And then the next cut is to the woman that they're both in love with, Olga. So that was very interesting to me, that was designed that way. And I don't know why, but it was very...
Eisenstein is one of those directors so seminal to the development of the medium that we can say two things about him. He not only concocts a whole set of rules or a whole set of ways of shooting that people would imitate till today. I mean, certainly they're imitated whether he would like it or not on 30-second advertisements all the time. Selling the revolution and selling soap can be used. The same methods can be used. But in addition to that, he's somebody who set up rules and then knew exactly when to break his own rules.
Broke his own rules,
Sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what is so extraordinarily interesting and really exciting about looking at what he's done, because you get to see him stating one thing and then trying something else, which is...
Yeah. Now, we've been talking thus far about so many of the visual aspects and some of the oral aspects of the film. I'd like to talk a little bit about something that may make this film a little not so palatable to a lot of people today, and that is the story. The story seems, many people when they're talking about a great film, the first thing...
It's very simple.
Yeah.
A slight story.
It's a very, very slight story. And so the critical complaint that would come from most people is, well, what I expect from a great narrative film, a film...
But it has a major cultural clash and a physical clash, too.
Okay.
And that was enough. Didn't have to have a story.
Well, let's make sure we give that background on what that clash was. I mean, this film was produced in 1938, and of course, it's a film, as you were saying earlier, that portrays the past, so the people can understand
The present.
the present. Yeah, and that's a mode of film I think quite familiar to those of us who've seen a lot of Eastern European
No,
cinema.
he gave it a name, too. In writing to Ivor Montague, he said, "We're making a big anti-fascist machine."
Machine.
Well, he had that sense of this monolithic force moving forward in many of the shots.
And all the things being carefully set into place and structured.
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the things, just to talk about the visuals of the film in relation to that idea, is that, as a number of critics have pointed out, everything having to do with Teutonic Knights is symmetrical, it's highly ordered. We think of the scene in which they have all of their shields down and they're repelling, at least initially repelling the Russians, whereas all those compositions with the Russians, though they have extraordinary beauty, they have magnificence, they're frequently asymmetrical. We have a notion that the Russians are, if not disorganized, they're reticent about being as machine-like themselves, or as orderly in exactly the ways the Teutonic Knights are orderly.
And he throws in a little decadence with the black monk,
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Well,
just to cover all the possibilities.
well I think a word we haven't used yet, but it was certainly apt to this kind of film, is it's allegorical. I mean, it comes out of a tradition of allegorical narrative where...
But not labeled that.
So we might, yeah. So what we might call it is an open allegory, where the audience, when seeing it, are...
Well, an allegory built out of fragments of reality,
Okay.
perhaps.
Okay, that's good. Now this film, of course, opens when in Russia?
12,
13th century.
yeah, 1240 something.
Okay, 1240 is when it's set. And as we were saying earlier,
These are crusaders. And on their way to Palestine, they were scooping up countries too.
okay.
And Russia was just another country for them to scoop up.
Okay. And do we really even know that much about that period? I mean,
Very little, very little.
yeah. So the notion that everyone had those particular haircuts or whatever was just something that's taken from icons or whatever.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that sort of thing.
He knew how to use research materials, so he could easily have manipulated them in any way he wanted
Yeah.
to get his purpose through.
Yeah. How was the film received in the Soviet Union itself?
Oh, as a great patriotic film,
Okay.
which it is, if you can forget all the terms about like operatic.
Okay, but it's officially received that way. Was it received popularly with enthusiasm?
Well, the medals that he'd been waiting for all of his career, he got
Okay.
through this film, and it opened film production for him again. But one big enemy and several small enemies had to leave the film administration before it was possible to do that.
Okay, and so this paved the way for the films that would come afterwards. Or did he get in trouble again? Is he the kind of guy who
Well,
would always be
the
getting?
trouble wasn't finished.
Okay. Okay.
The film that was to follow Alexander Nevsky didn't get made, but Ivan the Terrible did get made later.
This
With
was
lots of problems.
actually a great call to patriotism, which was ultimately then shelved
Oh,
as
yes.
soon as the
When saints
Soviet
could
German
easily be wearing armor and so on.
Okay, and when the Nazi
German
Soviet
non-aggression
non-aggression
pact.
pact was signed, this gets shelved, and then after the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis,
Brought
it
out
comes
again.
out again.
It was one of the first films to, after that June invasion.
Yeah, I bet it was one of the first films they had, and they were very, very glad they had that film. Well, at this point, I'm going to have to say I'm very, very glad we had this film here this evening. That's about all we have time for today. What I'd like to tell the people at home is if you'd like more information about this series or about cinema studies, undergraduate or graduate, please write Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me repeat that for you again. That address is Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Thank you both for being here this evening. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that our discussion here leads all of you to discussion and thought that you enjoy.
About all the things we didn't talk about.
all the things we didn't talk about. That's right. Welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm Jerry Carlson, your host, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today, we'll be seeing Federico Fellini's I Vittelloni. Made in 1953, this early work by Fellini was his first international success. In many ways, it anticipates his later, better-known work, Amarcord. In addition, a number of scholars have named it as a model for George Lucas's American Graffiti. We'll be talking about these matters and others after the screening. Today, our guests are Professor Mirella Afrin of the College of Staten Island and Professor Pellegrino Di Cerno of Hofstra University. Enjoy I Vittelloni. Entertainment industry.
Maybe it's because she realizes Mazzina is so much better than...
Okay. I hope you enjoyed I Vittelloni. If you tuned in a little bit later, this is Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I've got two guests this evening. I'd like to introduce them to you now. First of all, Professor Mirella Afrin. She's chair of the Department of Performing and Creative Arts at the College of Staten Island. She's lectured widely about and is expert about French and Italian cinema. In addition, she's currently one of the general editors of the Rutgers University Press film script series. Our second guest this evening is Professor Pellegrino Di Cerno. He's currently a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at Hofstra University. He's in the process of writing a book called, what is that again, Pelle?
Strange Loops.
Strange Loops, which is a study of modernist narrative sound, which includes a lengthy chapter on Fellini. Professor Di Cerno has also lectured extensively on the Italian cinema at a number of universities, including Columbia and Cornell. There's something about this film I think I'd like to begin with tonight, and I'd like to begin with you, Mirella. Most of the films we see that are of international origin have their titles translated when they come to the United States. This film's title is never given in translation. It's always I Vittelloni, which you coached me on pronouncing correctly, I have to admit. Could you tell us what it means literally and why it's a difficult thing to translate figuratively?
Well, it did have a translation into English, actually. It was called The Young and the Passionate,
Okay.
which I think is clearly an error. And maybe that was understood even at the time of that translation, that it didn't do justice, and actually it even distorted the sense of the characters who are I Vittelloni. I Vittelloni, if there is an American equivalent, might be a drugstore cowboy, or a British equivalent might be the teddy boy, some sort of post-World War II figure of young, but not very young men, sons of the bourgeoisie, who have a mother or a sister or father to make sure that they're housed and nourished, who are underemployed or unemployed and don't know what they want and don't really look for it, who spend their times in cafes and bars. And
If that's a figurative translation, what, I mean, I don't speak
literally.
Literally.
Oh,
What
literally,
does it mean?
Vittelloni means large calf, that is overgrown kid would be sort of an American equivalent.
Okay, okay. Now, Pele, what really was Italy like? I mean, is this a sociologically accurate view of what the place was like at the time? And you might, from there, we might want to go on to, since I brought up the question of sociologically accurate, about what this film's relation has to Italian neorealism. Okay, we got two questions. One, is this what it was like? And two, is this related to Italian neorealism, this film?
Well, I begin with the notion of the small town and the provinces after the post-war period. And I suspect that in some sense the film does bear a sociological power to render, I would call the psychology of the small Italian provincial town. It is an our town, but not ever observed in a sociological perspective, as the neorealist director strictly would do. Rather, what he gives us is a imaginary economy of the small Italian provincial town.
Yeah. Now, could these people be in a big city, or is this really just a matter of a small town? I mean, it's a particular kind of character these guys are in this
Well,
film.
it's part of the definition to be trapped always in the little world of the small town, and in the fantasies that entrapment breeds. And in fact, as you know, only one of them makes it to the outside, to the big city, and to the adventure of the big city.
And you know, Fellini had said at one point that if there were any film that he would try to make a continuance of, and he maybe Amarcord is a continuance or a reworking of this, but if there's any film, it would be this one, and he'd want to pick up Meraldo and what happens to him.
Right. In fact, there was a screenplay called Meraldo in Città, which wasn't made into a film, and which took up the adventures of the boy who had left the small town.
Well, I mean, that's intriguing, because I haven't seen that. I'd only known that he'd thought about it. Just briefly, what happens to Meraldo? I mean, I think our viewers would like to know what Fellini conceived of happening to him when he go to town, just in brief version.
Well, more or less, if you know La Dolce Vita,
Right.
It would be more or less a preliminary version of that. A boy going to town and having a set of sexual and spiritual initiations. Again, it more or less, if you know the other film that takes up the problem, Roma,
Right.
you have, again, the boy leaving the provinces and then making the spiritual discovery of the large city, its shocks, its aesthetics, its free life, and the economy of the large metropolis, whatever.
Yeah. Now, the films that immediately preceded this in Italian cinema that we think of significance are the ones that, for better or for worse, are labeled neorealism. What was Fellini, what was his relationship to realism? I mean, either Pele or Morella, do you want to jump in on that one?
I wondered if I could just go back just
Sure,
a little
sure.
bit
No,
to say
where you
this,
want.
that just to finish or continue what Pele was saying, that it is a little Fellini leaving the small town, Fellini as Vittelloni, that we, looking back on his life as a Vittelloni and his friends still Vittelloni back in Rimini, his town, when he makes that film in 1953. One other small point I think that we should make is that the voice of the narrator, the overvoice, is Fellini's voice. And when he says we and tells us the story, actually I think there were 13 narrative interventions, 5
Just
or
approximately,
6
right, yeah,
of them have a first-person plural, you know, a direct engagement to Fellini in his own narrative. That kind, and the presence of his brother Riccardo Fellini.
You stole mine next. Yeah.
Sorry, Jerry. As one of the actors, that kind of brings it all very, very close together, very autobiographical, very much.
And interestingly, of the 5 young men we're following, the one he discreetly does not follow that much, or is the character who's least developed, is Riccardo, his brother. It's as if it's almost too close to the character played by his brother to get underneath that that surface. Well, let's get back to neorealism.
Right.
I mean, there are 2 ways of going after this. I mean, one way is a kind of larger theoretical way, how the film is related. But before we do that, I'm also interested in, the very kind of biographical way. I mean, how is Fellini entangled or not entangled with neorealism? You want to, Pele?
Well, he has a very specific itinerary as Rossellini's assistant, not only in Open City and Paisan, but also as a major creator of the miracle with Anna Magnani, in which he plays a saint who appears. So he does serve a very strict neorealist itinerary, both under the tutelage of Rossellini, but then with other Germi and other neorealist directors.
I think maybe we should also mention the sort of the other Fabrizi, not Franco Fabrizi, who plays the role of Fausto in this film, but Aldo Fabrizi. And if the story goes that he's the one that encouraged Aldo Fabrizi to play with Anna Magnani in Open City.
Okay. So what we have is someone who's been caught up, and particularly in the Rossellini side of this. I mean, he had never worked, as I remember, with De Sico and Zavattini.
No.
La Tuada,
No.
with La Tuada in Variety Lights,
Okay.
with whom he is listed as
And
co-director.
Germi and Monicelli also, if I'm not mistaken.
Jeremy and Monicelli. So what we're getting at, by 1953, we're getting at a movement, if we can even call that if it's perhaps even wrong to say it's losing steam, but it's beginning a process of evolution into something else. Do you think that's accurate, or?
Oh, yes.
Well, it's. May I
please, Bella.
It's complicated. At one level, it became a genre. Neorealism became a genre that more or less betrayed itself. It became neorealism rosso, pink neorealism.
Okay.
And I always use the epitome. It reduced itself to the thighs of Anna Magnani in Bitter Rice. In other words, this kind of realist sexuality, or neorealist sexuality. Fellini instead represents the great moment of transition, and where you pass more or less from an objective cinema, capable of making all sorts of social and political observations and critiques, to a cinema, a more subjective and personal style of cinema making. And of course, I Vittelloni is the central film of that transition.
Yeah. It's interesting just to comment about the relationship between this kind of film and American cinema at the time as well, because it's hard for us perhaps to remember that neorealist cinema was incredibly popular on an international scale, and in fact comes into the American cinema and faces its own kind of, we may call it assimilation or we may call it corruption, because a film that I think many of our... Right. It's a film I'm thinking of, something like called North Side 777 with James Stewart, that I think probably many of our viewers have seen and remains in repertoire on American television. Is clearly influenced by neorealism, but at the same time ends up being an American journalism movie as well. So there's a dissipation of energies in a whole set of directions at the time. Does this come, and this movement towards subjectivity, does it come from Fellini? Does it come out of literature at the time as well? I mean,
well, I think it comes out of the passage of time. It comes out of a moment in history that that is in flux. We might look at it this way. I don't know if this is useful, but Franco Interlenghi, who plays Moraldo, was the young boy in Shoeshine in 1946.
okay.
And then Franco Interlenghi grows up and is Moraldo in Fellini's film. There's a little kid in the railroad boy in Fellini's kid with whom Moraldo exchanges hats,
Right,
as if
yes, yes.
exchanging
And
identity.
who's there at the train at the end. Right.
Who is then a kind of second generation boy of this neorealism. And the role of that boy, I think one might see it as sort of emblematic of this transformation from the kid in Shoeshine to a figure that is somewhat imaginary, coming out of the imagination of Moraldo, somewhat spiritual, as a spiritual guide without knowing that he's a guide at all, but certainly not as a street urchin, post-war street urchin trying to make a living. And one might see that, and I'm not so sure Fellini didn't see that quite consciously.
There's an interesting parallel there. The late Francois Truffaut was, of course, in some of his later films, criticized for not being the same Truffaut he was in the earlier films. But since Jean-Pierre Lowe is a thread throughout the films, I mean, we see over that body of films Jean-Pierre Lowe going from being the 12 or 13-year-old child to being a man who's having significant problems in the middle of his marriage. So there's something something analogous going on there, that as the people that he's dealing with, his characters on the screen, change, the nature of his cinema's got to change as well. Well, we might want to talk about, this is a film of stunning moments. I mean, I think it has an incredible structural complexity and interest that I think we can turn back to in a few minutes. But I think now what we might want to do is talk about some of those scenes that they're real grabbers. I mean, they're scenes that a lot of people remember, even if they don't remember some of the structural complexities of the film. Years later, they come back and say, "Oh, that's the film with." What I think I'm going to do now is give Pele a chance to talk about, you might say, favorite scenes or scene of significant interest, and how you think scenes of significant interest work in this film. I mean, well, they're not just special effects scenes. I mean, there aren't special effects, but it's not like, oh yes, that's when they created this or that. They're special in other ways.
Well, they're magic moments, and they do observe a very specific dramaturgy. What you usually find is, at a certain moment, the Fellinian film will turn into a stage. And usually what happens is that the stage will be filled up, and then it will be emptied. And I call it the dialectic between the full and the empty. So there's this extraordinary rhythm. You build up to a state of excitement, and then there's a gradual emptying that occurs. And it has to do with the drawing forth of the spectacle, because the spectacle is always the key moment. And you can see it here both in the carnival scene, which begins gradually, builds up to this high point, and then there's this incredible emptying out of the frame and of the image of the set. And then you usually find a moment of truth occurring here in the piazza, which is again one of the great stages. You transfer from the stage of the ball to the stage of the piazza, where the character then must confront himself in some way and come to terms with the moment of truth that usually occurs again at dawn, after the spectacle and its promise has been flawed, has emptied itself of its value.
That, I want to continue just with a couple of the scenes, but that may be one of the ways in which we can talk about, I think, the conspicuous modernity of this film. While the costumes, the particular era being portrayed has certainly passed, this film looks and feels extraordinarily modern, or more accurately modernist in a whole set of ways. And one of the ways I think you've just pointed towards is that notion of that moment of revelation, or as the phrase that everyone uses in comment about modernist literature, the epiphany, and that these characters find out something about themselves. They may not be capable of changing themselves, their material condition, their behavior, their future, but they've had that kind of revelation. And it's a kind of climax we don't find in that many films. We only find in a certain body of films. Well, I've let you do one of your favorite scenes or whatever, so I think following our favorite scenes line here, Morella, what do you think of? I mean, what are some of the scenes that you think most memorable, and why? I mean, how does it work within the film?
Well, perhaps the most memorable scene is the one that follows, the one that Pele was mentioning, after the carnival scene in the theater, then into this empty piazza, it's dawn, and then Moraldo drags Alberto home, Alberto barely able to stand from the night of reveling, still in costume, dragging this great head of a puppet, enormous head under his arm, in front of his house, propped up against the wall of his house, and sees in the distance his sister leaving with the mysterious man with the sunglasses, and becomes sober, you know, just immediately at this understanding that the sister is leaving, and leaving forever, and understanding not only the shame to his family, but I think the shaking of the foundations, his own foundations, and those of his mother, and what that means to him, both in terms of practical terms of sustenance, financial terms, and then all of a sudden whipping off his wig and running up the stairs, and then the great scene of embrace of the mother, and the promise that he will become a man at last and take responsibility. And that, I think, is just an amazing moment of revelation, epiphany at dawn, just as you both had indicated.
It's interesting that in that way, we could say, I mean, certainly we can say the film is episodic, but compared to the kinds of story structures a lot of people are used to, which are linear and causal, we know exactly where we're going. Either the Allied bombers blow up the dam, or they don't. The movements here are just among this set of friends. And the film is over when Moraldo chooses to leave. He separates himself, but we get this sense in which the film could also go on.
Yes, sure.
It does go on for the Vittelloni, trapped in their existence. But what's interesting about these master scenes, or these major scenes that usually follow this rhythm, and that's this powerful rhythm of filling up and then emptying, is our relationship as a viewer. Because at the heart of these scenes is always a spectacle. And what it is, the character's desire is invested in that spectacle. And what is interesting, and this is where the subjective camera will come in, is that we're placed in the character's desire for the spectacle, to be deluded, caught up by the power of the spectacle. But at the same time, Fellini will separate us from that process of identification and expose the shabbiness and the emptiness of the illusion. And this kind of ambivalence between, which the spectator clearly feels, between our identification with the character and our distanciation from the illusion in which the character is caught up, gives us that particular ambivalent feeling that's so characteristic of Fellini's cinema.
It's interesting that we have Fellini's voice who's doing it. We have the reference to the we, all the Vittelloni, but there's also an interesting temporal relationship, because on the one hand we've got all this marvelous subjective camera movement and subjective cutting at certain moments, yet at the same time we're distant when we have that. I mean, it's a distance of sympathy, of regret, of judgment, a whole set of things, but we're not only physically distant, we're temporally different. There's a whole aura of regret surrounding the use of
blues. Fellini's version of the blues. But you see that clearly in the vaudeville scene, where again you're caught up in the imaginary, the pull of the desire of the spectacle, and at the same time you're made to see how shabby it is. And then you get gradually caught up, especially with Leopoldo's desire to become, all his dreams get folded or become projected upon his encounter with this old vaudevillian who's obviously bogus. But yet we're caught up, and at the same time we feel the bogusness, and so we're caught in this delicious ambivalence, which is part of the bittersweetness, blues brightness of Fellini and his cinema.
Right, and he does it in a couple of ways. As I remember in the opening scene of the beauty contest, is it Miss Siren of 1953 that Sandra becomes, and of course then she faints, and we've been caught up in this. It's a very interesting, because on the one hand everybody's clearly excited about this ceremony, yet its provinciality, its kind of tawdriness, its meaninglessness, except for the desires of those characters, I think is pretty obvious to us. And then Fellini, as I remember, he injects the subjective shot after she's fainted, and we see all the people judging her in that way, and it's a judgment far harsher, far more severe than the one of all the effervescence of, gee, she's Miss Siren of 1950.
And there's something very subtle, because immediately the father is pointed out very subtly through a system of glances and of camera work. So we do finger the father.
Who done it?
Yeah, no, we know exactly, and we're going to follow him through his various escapades as a salesman for religious relics. But how do you think some of these scenes that are memorable, how they work? They work as revelations, but how do they work for structuring the film, Morella? I mean, it's a...
Well, the film is structured at the beginning, I think, by it's sort of placed in time. It's the end of the season, and the rain which comes, which rains very heavily on Sandra in more than one sense, crowning as Miss Siren. The season is then broken up as it gets into winter, and into the town becomes deserted. Different episodes that go along with the marriage, the pregnancy, the wedding, different moments, finally to Carnival and what will be the beginning of another season. So it has a kind of unity of time, which is not of a day, but of almost of a year, when spring comes.
The same structure of that Amarcord will have.
Okay, well let's move on to Amarcord, because I think that's a film that many of our viewers will have already seen. It at this point, whether justly or not, it's the more famous film, the more available film, because it's readily available on video cassette and it is much in the rep houses.
It should be called the pre-Vittelloni.
The pre-Vittelloni?
Yes, as in pre-Oedipal.
Of course, it's also interesting that it's another one of those titles that is not translated, as we hear it as Amarcord, and just, I think some people know it, but it is in the dialect of Rimini, as I know from my reading, not from knowing the dialect of Rimini, it means I remember as well. But it's interesting because we change. I mean, it is 25 years later, over 20 years later, when Fellini is doing this. I mean, what ways are they?
We change and we don't change.
Okay, let's do and don't for a while.
Of our town, Italian style, you have the same, more or less, chorus. You have a protagonist that's distributed into various roles, but you have, again, the townspeople caught up in what I would call their imaginary desire, in the imaginary, in the illusions by which they live. And so in a sense it's very close, also structurally, because the trap, again, is not so much the small town, but the trap is, again, the limits of the imagination. And what you see in Amarcord is always the pressure of the epiphany, of the magic moment, the ocean liner Rex, for example,
Right.
which comes from the outside. Just as, for instance, the epiphany in I Vittelloni, where Giudicio, the town idiot, who reappears again in Amarcord, will gaze at the statue of the angel. Again, it's that moment. Those are the Fellinian moments, the epiphanies, the peacock, that again comes to rupture ordinary life.
Okay. Well, aside from the fact that one's in color and the other's not, what do you think about the fact, Morello, that I always think of Amarcord as being, well, holding all those similarities as being its later Fellini, and it's more, I don't know if I want to say extreme, perhaps I want to say stylized. It's as if in I Vittelloni you can see how this was a neo-realist picture in some aspects. I mean, no one mistakes Amarcord for a neo-realist.
No. But even, I think what you have in I Vittelloni is some funny reversal of this kind. For example, the piazza to which we referred earlier is a piazza in a town of Viterbo, I think. But at least to my eyes, it appears like a set. So, there is a kind of, in I Vittelloni, what you have is, some neo-realist canon-like location shooting in Fellini's hands and in the hands of the cameraman, Martelli, becomes, violates the neo-realist canon,
Right.
appears to while it upholds it. In Amarcord, of course, the imagination is all of the matter.
Right, the remembering eye of I remember. And as I think as a couple of critics have pointed out, a lot of other critics criticizing critics, that the realism of neorealism has always been
Poetic.
Poetic. Well, also because I'm thinking of specific aspects. When one thinks of Bicycle Thieves, of the De Sica films, well, the music is always intrusive. I mean, that tradition is never subdued. Thinking also of that film, the moment when the bicycle is stolen, a moment that many people remember, well, that's a self-reflexive moment because he is putting up a poster of Rita Hayworth. And so we're drawing attention to, the cinema at the very moment that we're
And locating it in time very precisely.
Yeah, exactly.
But the other problem, of course, is the relationship of the director. What kind of intervention the director can make and how he can make himself present by the movement of camera or by taking up various narrative strategies. If we're going to trace or understand Fellini's evolution from passage out of neorealism into this authorial style, into this personal style, we'd have to exactly focus on the way in which he marks the film in terms of himself, in terms of his own intervention as a director. And of course, you begin to see it in terms of these archetypical moments where he's building a film around no longer a strict objective representation of reality, but around a rhythm that in some way is psychic, mythological, internal almost. This passage that I call the passage from the empty to the full to the empty, you see, is symptomatic in this respect.
And would you take, Pelle, would you take the real crucial moment in his development, that transition from La Dolce Vita to 8½, where we have the chronicle, in some aspect, objective chronicle of the corruption of the young man from the provinces when he's come to Rome, and then the incredible subjectivity of 8½, and the fantasies, the going back, the going...
And plus the mirroring of his own film. Excuse me.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's okay.
No, it has also something to do with finding the funding for the film.
Well, right.
La Strada, for example, which was the film he wanted to make, and was not going to make, he couldn't find the funding for, and the funding for I Vittelloni at that moment in '53 could be found, and La Strada then was put off.
Well, we haven't run out of funding, but we have run out of time. I hope you enjoyed Vittelloni and our discussion. If you'd like more information about this series or about cinema studies at an undergraduate or graduate level at the College of Staten Island, please send us a self-addressed stamped envelope. That address is Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me repeat that address for you again. It is Cinema One, Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. What I'd like to do is thank both of you for being here. It was a pleasure having both of you here. And what I'd like to say to the people at home is I hope that you enjoyed our discussion and that it leads you to thought and discussion that you enjoy. Good evening. Well, we can go from here. Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm Jerry Carlson, your host, and I teach film studies at the College of Staten Island. Today we'll be seeing Fritz Lang's Scarlet Street. Made in 1945, the film is actually a remake of Jean Renoir's La Chienne, made in France in the 1930s. In addition, Scarlet Street is frequently named as one of the finest examples, early examples that is, of the American film style known as film noir. We'll be discussing film noir and other matters after the screening. Today, our guests are Professor Robert Lyons of Queens College and Professor Charles Affron of New York University. Enjoy Scarlet Street. Back and hi, I hope you enjoyed Scarlet Street. If you've just tuned in, this is Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. Today we have two guests, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. Our first guest is Professor Robert Lyons. He's the Director of American Studies Program at Queens College. In addition, he's one of the general editors of the Rutgers on Film series. Even more than that, he's the editor of the recently published, within the last year and a half, I think.
That's right.
Script of John Ford's My Darling Clementine. Second guest is Professor Charles Affron, who teaches in the French and Italian Studies program at New York University. Professor Affron spends a lot of time writing about movies, though. He's the author of numerous articles, several books, most recently, Cinema and Sentiment, a study of 30s melodrama.
30s, 40s. Yeah.
30s and 40s melodrama. And in the very near future, in the very same, this is beginning to look suspicious, Charles, the very same Rutgers screenplay series, you'll have Fellini's 8.5 published.
That's right.
Okay. Okay, well, those are our two friends for today. I thought we might just start, Bob, by talking about Scarlet Street and this strange phrase, film noir. I mean, I already told our audience this is an early fine example of film noir. We might start just by talking about what is film noir, much less why this is a good example of it.
It's a phrase that does get attached to Scarlet Street most of the time when you talk about it.
Film noir is a kind of attitude, a sense that people have relatively little freedom in their moral choices, characters in films, that is, and relatively little freedom in determining what kinds of lives they can or might lead. And it creates a world in which people are driven by obsessions, in which violence is never very far below the surface of things. It's also a kind of film style. It's a special series of choices. I'm sure we'll be talking about this in connection with the film.
One of the interesting things I think about film noir is it sometimes is called a genre and sometimes it's not called a genre.
Yes, yes. It is a very identifiable kind of film,
right,
but at the same time it lacks the conventions of plot and the significant sort of single major character that a Western or a horror film would have, where you can determine the good guy and a configuration of the rustler and the sheriff and so forth that the Western has. And instead, its identifying mark are these characteristics of atmosphere and a general attitude toward human life that you find in the obsessed and lonely figures in Scarlet Street.
Now, are there a couple of predecessors to this film that we would call in the genre? This film was released in late 1945.
Yes, yes. Well, they're films of the period, earlier films that Lang himself made. You might want to argue that something like The Maltese Falcon already has some traits of this sort of film. The Woman in the Window, which is an immediate predecessor with the same actors from Lang, directed by Lang, has again this noir feel to it. And it's really in 1945 and 1946, the years that Charles has studied in Hollywood filmmaking, that noir becomes a very important...
Well, that kind of moves us over to Charles.
Right.
But what I was kind of interested in, Charles, was the immediate context. I mean, what's really going on in Hollywood in those couple of years?
It's a very interesting moment because of the transition from the kinds of wartime fictions and interests of Hollywood and to peacetime. And there are both films that are, we would call escapist and family entertainments that are very, very popular, but also, particularly in 1946, a lot of films that feature this kind of atmosphere that Bob has talked about, and certain visions of women and men that are not so frequent in the previous years. When you think that in 1946, really the year of the release of of Scarlet Street, films such as Gilda and help me with some of the other titles.
Martha Ivers.
Martha Ivers.
Postman
Always Rings Twice. The woman as a kind of morally ambiguous figure, a woman who sells herself sexually for money. This figure, of course, is a tried and true figure way back to the Vamp.
Sure.
But becomes a very concentrated figure in that year of '46. Ingrid Bergman, who both plays the nun in Bells of St. Mary's in '46, also plays in Notorious. And Saratoga Trunk is released in '45, where she is not a prostitute, but a woman who
of questionable virtue.
Of questionable virtue, and made specifically so.
Yeah, well. One of the things that's interesting to me about this historically is, of course, what we've had is in the early '40s, the industry revving itself up, getting everyone behind the war effort. Yet the war effort's going to bring to the forefront of American culture a whole set of questions, and it's as if at almost the moment the war is over, those questions come to the forefront. I don't think it takes that much of an historical imagination to think that there's been a lot of American men who've been away from home for quite a while, and all of a sudden there's a whole set of ambiguous questions about what women are really doing and what is this kind of role they come up with.
Yes, and of course, too, the sense that films emphasize the patriotic and the escapist during the war, shifting here to look at some of the darker aspects of human behavior and a much more pessimistic sense of life itself. One of the other films from 1946, The Killers, points to something else about this kind of film, and that is the number of German-trained directors like Lang himself who came to Hollywood. And
so there's a certain sense in which all of the horrible things going on in Germany brings a whole host of incredibly gifted directors to the United States to reveal a whole host of things that hasn't been explored in American film before. Okay, we've got Fritz Lang, Robert Siodmak, who made the Killers.
The Killers.
Billy Wilder.
Zinnemann.
Fred Zinnemann, okay.
These are, I think, the major figures.
Otto Preminger.
Otto Preminger, that's right.
Okay.
And from France as well, a whole host of émigré directors who came not primarily for professional reasons, but for political reasons, who would have been probably happy to stay there. And in fact, it's often said that Lang was never very comfortable in America and wanted to, and in fact did return to Germany.
In about 56 or 57.
His last 3 films are in a sense German studio films, so peculiar ones.
Yeah, very well. Always with those peculiar Lang touches.
But the American career lasted about 20 years, a little over 20 years, and he was very, very active here. He must have made more than a film a year, I would think.
Yeah, but never particularly. I mean, he's one of those people, you might say, he got more control of his films than a lot of other directors, with significant exceptions of the Hawks, the Ford, the Hitchcock, but never had as much control over his films as he had when he was around. That was his constant frustration.
When he was in Germany, yes.
Yeah, that was his constant.
Well, the studios and the production code were problems that he had to surmount.
Well, there's another thing common to these all the films we've named that's very interesting, and that is they all seem to deflect themselves in one way or another from a kind of linear plot. I mean, they do it in the instance of something like The Killers by fragmenting it extraordinarily. So we have an investigator who goes and talks to people and who's just piecing the story together fragment by fragment. But here, there's a way in which the characters seem to believe each in different stories. I mean, there's a...
Yes. Each one has its own vision and fantasy of what the other people are and what their own life is going to be. And the audience is detached from that and separated from it and sees each of these characters as in some way blinded, I think.
Yeah, that's. But I want to come back, talk about people being blinded. I had mentioned earlier that there is, this film is a remake of a film by Jean Renoir. And Charles, maybe tell us a little bit about La Chienne, and tell us a little bit about how these films are alike and what they have in common, and then what makes, without evaluating, I think we both agree they're both terrific films. Nobody wants to kind of draw a scorecard on La Chienne versus Scarlet Street, but everybody thinks of Jean Renoir and Fritz Lang as highly different temperaments. Now, how does that show up in the two?
In every possible way it shows up, and it's sort of a precious kind of contrast because we have here major directors, very major directors, dealing with exactly the same property, although the plots are really identical with a few variations, and the films couldn't be more different because of the tone, because of the way the films are staged, because of the way they're acted, because of the protagonists, but the plots are precisely the same. There is in Renoir's films always a sense of improvisation, of things happening in front of the camera, whereas in Lang's everything is so pre-planned and rigid, which of course corresponds to this noir world that Bob was defining before.
It's fatalism about
right.
it.
Now, I don't think you could define La Chienne as a proto-film noir. I mean, although there is a view of Paris, the night world of Paris, and the meeting between the Robinson figure and the prostitute, who is specifically that in the French film, is the same. But that said, there is not that sense of despair, particularly at the end. Michel Simon, who plays that character, does not give you that.
Renoir always gives me a sense, perhaps you won't approve of the word, but he always gives me that sense that there's a slight effervescence to all of his characters. I mean, I think it comes from improvisational method, but they never seem fully trapped. I mean, in terms of story and plot, they may get trapped, but there's always some other aspect of them, perhaps expressed through body language, expressed just through a gesture, or expressed through a throwaway line. That's always that sense of surplus about them as humanity. And there's a way in which in Scarlet Street, many of the characters, in a way that we come to be very interested in, are what we see. And it's when people try to add on something to them. And when you try to make someone who may be manifestly, to us, a girl who is prostitute-like on the street, when you try to make her into an icon of something else is when you get into trouble.
Right. I really would like to speculate about the end of the two films, which I think shows the difference, the fundamental difference. You sense that for the bum in the French version, this is a liberation.
Okay.
And for Robinson, it is certainly not. I mean, he is entrapped by guilt, and guilt is not a quality you find in Lenoir's universe. It's very rare, and it certainly is not there in that film. I mean, he's gone on the skids, but there he is. He picks up the cigar butt, and a little bit like the end, the last laugh, rather.
Right, a little bit of the last laugh.
Right.
Well, that takes us over into territory about this film in the 40s, and the fact that I guess there's two aspects of it I think that are very interesting, that are very closely related to one another. And one is, in what sense is this film restricted by the production code in what it can portray? And then the complementary question is, to what degree does the film not care about those restrictions because it's so clever in its portrayal indirectly?
Well, I think that the effort, the necessity not to identify explicitly the prostitute and the pimp leads to an even greater sense of the kinkiness of the relationship, because you no longer have the stereotyped character of pimp-prostitute relation. Instead, you have Duryea and Joan Bennett talking about liking mean and vicious men and being slapped around and so forth. And it becomes much more a psychosexual bond in that way.
So this is one of those great tricks, you know, we all always hear about, of using the restriction of, oh, well, you can't deal with this. You say, so, you give us X little category that we can't deal with. Well, we'll deal with it, all the boundary around that X little category, which is really even much more interesting than X itself.
It happens again in a different way when you have that scene near the end of the film where Robinson is going up to view the execution, or to be as close as he can to the execution. Right. And the newspaper reporters talk to him about inner guilt and that being a greater punishment than any kind of external justice. And that's intended, I think, to solve certain production code problems. But the effect of the dramatization of the inner guilt, the hallucinatory voices, Robinson's isolated on the street and so forth, is not to confirm a satisfying sense of justice, but rather to confirm the bleakness of the vision of the whole film, I think.
Yeah, that's really that's very interesting. And I'm also curious about, you know, some of the other things. I mean, the dynamics of that sexual relation. I'm thinking of a number of the well, first of all, the way in which Edward G. Robinson first sees her. I mean, that Joan Bennett is attired, interestingly. It's a rainy evening, but I think, as some critics have said, she's dressed up like a bonbon.
Well, I think there are ways of interpreting that raincoat. In other words, we see through the raincoat, and we see her as he never does. He maybe sees a woman in a raincoat, but we see a raincoat that's transparent. One little note there, I've always, whenever I see it, I remember a film that perhaps Lang knew, which is Quai des Brumes, Port of Shadows, which was a very popular late 30s French film in which Michel Morgan appears in precisely that kind of transparent raincoat. A very different character, but a very important female icon of that period. Well,
and Joan Bennett herself has had an interesting career as an as an evolving icon. She changes herself a couple of times through her career.
Right, right. Joan Bennett comes from that rather renowned acting family. Her father, Richard Bennett, and her sister, Constance Bennett, was a very big star in the early 30s. And Joan Bennett appears in one of the very important early sound films, Bulldog Drummond, with Ronald Colman. It's his first talkie and sort of establishes his career in the talkies. She plays the ingenue, and she's blonde, and very emphatically blonde, through most of the 30s until I think 37 or 38, a film called Trade Winds.
Okay.
Most people remember her as Amy in Little Women with Katharine Hepburn.
Okay, the famous, the legendary Little
The
Women.
Cure version. And then she turns into a Hedy Lamarr lookalike with the black hair often parted in the middle, and that really establishes her persona from the late 30s through the 40s, and it becomes key to Woman in the Window and Scarlet Street.
Now, the ideal thing would be for us to have a double feature this evening. We couldn't quite do it, but it would be to see Woman in the Window and Scarlet Street back to back, that sort of thing. There's some, it's interesting because both films have the same triangle, that is, of Edward G. Robinson, Joan Bennett, and the master of sleaze, Dan Duryea. No, he's just wonderful in these roles. But Bob, for those in the audience who perhaps haven't seen Woman in the Window recently, let's just say, could you talk about it just a little bit and some of the differences between the two, or?
Well, one difference is that the major difference is that Lang uses a frame of a dream, and the end of the movie, which to most people is rather dissatisfying, is that the figure of Robinson, once again, a man who becomes involved, not entrapped in the same kind of way as in Scarlet Street, but involved with a woman and also drawn into a mesh of circumstances that he did not initially create. By the end of that film, when we think we have seen an inevitable solution that is leading to the death of Robinson, Robinson wakes up in his club and we discover that it is all been a dream.
Voila. So the wish fulfillment has been played out in a dream context. Well, you know, this is interesting, and many people complain these days, and justly, about the phenomenon of, oh, well, you know, it's only Jaws Part 2, or it's a remake, or something like that. This is one of those instances in which you have a successful film, that The Woman in the Window, in which one can suspect Lang probably wasn't satisfied with the way he could work out the narrative.
Yes.
And so then it's successful, so what works better than success? Oh, gee, you want to remake this film? Sure, remake this film. Ah, but we have to do something different. Sure, do something different. And so what you end up is with the difference that, it displaces that, since both films have to do with this notion of wish fulfillment. I mean, it's that old joke, what's worse than not having what you want? Getting it. And working out the logic of getting your desires. And so, I mean, it overtly ends up being a cautionary tale in The Woman in the Window.
Yes.
And you're allowed, and it also keeps the audience off the hook as well in that film, because, you know, it says, oh, well, boy, it didn't happen to him, and so therefore if it didn't happen to him, maybe it won't happen to us either.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it was also marketed as a kind of surprise ending, which was a characteristic of a lot of marketing in that period. You know, no one will be let into the theater during the last 5 minutes. Don't tell your friends what happened. But he also apparently liked that ending. It was not imposed on him, the dream ending of Woman in the Window.
In the Window.
No.
Okay, so he liked it.
And he developed a rather elaborate shooting procedure for changing Robinson's clothes during the course of that shot where he wakes up. He's wearing a breakaway suit, which they pull away as the camera comes in on him, and then you see him wearing a different suit. Yes.
I've never heard of a breakaway suit.
Well, apparently that's what they did.
But one thing that he does do that changes Scarlet Street is to make the audience fully aware of the exact circumstances of Robinson's involvement with Bennett and Duryea. That is, from the very beginning of the film, of course, we know who they are.
Right, yeah.
And that gives us a very different sense of the morally decent man, because his decency becomes equated with blindness and an inability to understand things. That, again, darkens the sense
so the
of
American innocent becomes the person who will commit crime. I
Yes.
mean,
Yes,
you know, so
yes.
the innocence, the perpetual sense of innocence in America as protection. We're better because we're innocent, and then when we wake up, we'll do things the right way, gets smudged, one would even say kind of rubbed out.
Yes, and we don't identify, of course, with his, I don't think, at least the audience identifies with the sense of his travail as much as sees it from the outside. One of the things that strikes me is the degree of detachment that we have, even to the very last shot, which is, you know, one of these high-angle shots of Robinson first in a crowd and then alone on the
Well,
street.
you know, I think we would all agree that it's an ironic film. I mean, because we're positioned to know everything that's happening among these people, and I mean, I don't think. I mean, perhaps you'll disagree with me, Charles, but I think there are ways in which, you know, this film echoes things like some Nabokov novels that are very kind of dark, and in which we're seeing, we're both positioned to understand what the characters are doing, but at the same time, we're supposed to laugh with a kind of godly distance as well. And in that way, it's a very modernist kind of film. I mean,
I think it's sustained by the most important set in the film, which is the Greenwich Village apartment that he's rented for her. The irony of a glass partition. What does a glass partition divide? The outside terrace where scenes are enacted inside and outside, and that used in that final scene where Robinson comes in and overhears them, you know, making love or her talking to him. Not the final scene, the last.
right. The scene before.
The scene
her
before
murder, her
that.
murder. Right.
This kind of eavesdropping in this place where there is no privacy, but there are various levels which allows his voyeurism and our voyeurism to function.
And of course, earlier in the film, we've had the suggestion that she has a roommate, and we are led from her sense of rapport with Johnny, etc., just to assume that the roommate is Johnny. Then, of course, we find out she does have a girl who's a roommate, but later on in the film,
Johnny's her roommate.
Johnny's her roommate.
Very much so, and I think to get back to the point about censorship, so much is more than suggested here by the clothes lying around on the floor, the boater hat on the bed, or there's a kind of intimacy about this film, about what's happening between them that is very, very strong in Hollywood films of that period.
I mean, a line like "Come on, lazy legs."
Come on, lazy legs, exactly.
And you know, the suggestion that she's lazy legs because she doesn't like standing around modeling.
Girdles.
If anybody wants to stop it at that point, it's that wonderful 40s stuff where if you want to be naive about this film, it'll sure be naive about the film. But if you want to be a little bit more worldly about the film, then it opens up in, should I say, even ripe ways.
Well, sure. Just that the first scene between them in Tiny's bar, when he's asking her about she asks him, "What do you think I do for a living?" And she's sucking on that straw and leaning back in her chair. And he says, "Oh, you're an actress." Well, indeed she is, and she's doing a very good job at that moment.
And she begins. I mean, she first says, "Guess,"
Yes.
and then of course the audience. The viewing audience guesses in a different way than Robinson. And I think, again, that device all the way through means that as Robinson insists on, as the portrait itself suggests, and as he says, "I've never seen a woman without clothes," to his wife at one point, as Robinson insists on purity, the notion that we always have of the gap between what he sees and experience makes the sexuality and of the apartment, of the relationships, of the strewn clothes that much more intense.
And I mean, while Lang is in 40s ways discreet about where he focuses his camera during the murder sequence, this whole extraordinarily ambivalence on Edward G. Robinson's part of it, he wants the virtue. But you're saying, well, how can you want virtue and choose this woman? How can you really want? I mean, aren't there multiple layerings of your desire going on here, as emphasized by the fact that the murder weapon is an ice pick? So we have the murder as this brutal sexual violation, as the murder as a rape, and this is he gets what the initial promise of it was. Yeah. That's
talking about the levels in the apartment as you were before. One of the other one of the things we really haven't talked about noir film is style and low-key lighting and
the rainy streets
and the great attention to the creation of setting and so forth that evokes and not just supports the feeling of the film and the thematics of the film, but really creates it.
And fits so many different genres, which you referred to in the beginning.
And it's one of the things that goes from a detective film
to a melodrama.
Melodrama like The Strange Loves of Martha Ivers, over into a crime melodrama like this. When we think of Martha Ivers as really a domestic melodrama.
Or even some musicals that have something like Dollface, which is the same year. Some black and white musicals often have that kind of New York, urban, rainy side to them.
Empty streets, glistening light. The whole episode at the beginning of the film where Robinson first encounters Bennett and
with the glistening streets.
Yes, I mean that's the epitome of the noir.
And
the L.
And the L going in the background, and of course it's that long shot
and
when
the
he first
emptiness
sees,
of it all.
Yes. I think I'll walk home. I think I'll walk to the subway.
And you get lost in the maze of Greenwich Village.
I've had that feeling myself a few times. That's right.
And it explains in a way why you can make a film which is so directly located in New York. I mean, the references to Greenwich Village and to the city, and has, for budgetary reasons and studio set reasons, relatively few people around through most of the film. I mean, because the city as presented here is a place with characters locked into their own kinds of fantasies, projections, obsessions, and therefore the notion of a populated street is irrelevant.
Is irrelevant, and the glistening sense of the city, but it's not a glistening that's appealing in the way of beautiful big stores and that sort of that sort of thing. Well, on this light little note of very dark, urban, deserted streets, and why you shouldn't bump into people in Greenwich Village at 3 a.m. We're going to have to draw our discussion to a close. I want to thank both of you for being here.
Thank you.
And I'd now like to tell our audience that if you'd like to know more about this series, or if you'd like to know more about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate, at the College of Staten Island, please send us a self-addressed stamped envelope. You should send it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me repeat that address for you, okay? That's Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion that you enjoy. Good day. Welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm Jerry Carlson, your host, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today we'll be seeing The Man Who Knew Too Much. It's the only film that Hitchcock made twice, originally in 1934 and again in 1956. We'll be seeing the 1934 version, which in many ways illustrates the patterns of Hitchcock's filmmaking for the 40 years that followed. Today, our guests are going to be Professor Janet Cutler of Montclair State College and Professor Royal Brown of Queens College. Enjoy The Man Who Knew Too Much. Hi, I hope you enjoyed The Man Who Knew Too Much. Welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. Today we have two guests. Our first guest is Professor Janet Cutler, who's coordinator of film studies at Montclair State College. Janet is a scholar of the American cinema, of the avant-garde cinema, and has published on both. Our other guest today is Professor Royal Brown. He is the chair of film studies at Queens College. He has published extensively on Hitchcock, the French New Wave, film music, film aesthetics. In addition to that, Professor Brown teaches in the French literature program at the CUNY Grad Center. Well, I thought we might start today by just talking about where The Man Who Knew Too Much, this 1934 version, where it fits in Hitchcock's career. Royal, what's Hitchcock? It's 1934. Hitchcock makes films for another 40 years, 42 years, I guess. One way,
give or take.
Yeah, give or take.
42 sounds good.
Okay, 42 sounds good. What's going on in his career at this point? I mean, is this an early? Can we call this an early film, or is it really?
Oh yes, it's an early film. He has behind him such great films as The Lodger, Blackmail, and Murder, which fit into his category of master of suspense, but this is a large step towards establishing him as the master of suspense. The Lodger is purely a silent film. Blackmail, interestingly, exists as both a silent film and as a sound film, and then the two versions are fairly different at certain points. And there's also a German version called Mary of Blackmail. So we have here, and then you have Murder, which is thoroughly a sound film, and you have here one of his first great sound suspense films.
Yeah, so we've got a pattern here that we're going to see repeated in a number of ways through some of the other 30s. I mean, the most famous films of the 30s, I take it to be the 39 Steps, The Lady Vanishes.
Young and Innocent.
Young and Innocent.
Sabotage, not to be confused with the American film Saboteur.
Saboteur.
And The Secret Agent, which also, like this film, has Peter Lorre in it, and it even plays even more of a psycho. I mean, a totally off-the-wall killer in Secret Agent.
Yeah, that's what. I was wondering, Janet, about this film. I mean, it's a Hollywood film that's made in Britain, but most people think of Hitchcock as a Hollywood filmmaker. However, there's some things about this film that aren't Hollywood-like at all. I wonder if you.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think the thing that struck me the most when I saw this film was the fact that you seem to see Hitchcock much closer to his Soviet experiences and his German influences, and that they exist in this film in a much more undiluted form. When you look at the editing patterns in this film, they're very disturbing and very disorienting, much more so than in the American films. And you also get in this film some subjective camera work and a clear indication of the way he was influenced by his work in Germany and at UFA.
Yeah. Now, how did he, I don't know, how did he come to know the Soviet montage? Is that just a matter of they were shown around in Europe, or, I mean, because he never went to the Soviet Union himself, as far as I know, so it was the matter that Soviet film of that time was some of the most thrilling cinema the world has ever seen, and I mean, we even know Kurosawa in his interviews recently, and when he says something like, well, you know, what is your inspiration for Ron? He'll talk about the fact that his inspiration are the great Soviet films that he saw when he was a kid in the 1920s. I take it it's the same sort of thing for Hitchcock, that he's just, it's in the atmosphere at the...
It's in the atmosphere. He didn't go to the Soviet Union, but he certainly went to Germany a lot. He spent a lot of time in Germany, and was very much more deeply involved in German Expressionism. The Soviet influence, you would have to say, came from seeing the films and not from being involved in the Soviet filmmaking scene.
But of course, I think one of the things that's true, or one of the things that he talks about a lot in his interviews, is how much he was a kind of spokesman for montage and a spokesman for the whole principle of putting a film together through editing. The whole idea that you create an involvement for the audience with the film by piecing a film together through fragments, and then it becomes up to the audience to piece together those fragments and come up with conclusions.
Oh, absolutely. The classic thing that one says about Hitchcock, of course, is that the film was already shot in his mind before he ever set foot on the set, to the degree that he really didn't like particularly being there as a director. It was all made in his mind, and actually shooting the film was work. Brian De Palma, who has slavishly imitated Hitchcock in several of his films, does pretty much the same thing, except he in an interview that I did with him, he told me that he actually took, for his storyboards, worked from a lot of photographs, stills that he would take ahead of time. But Hitchcock worked definitely with the film edited in his mind. You save a lot of money this way, of course. You don't have to bracket your shots. You don't have to do multiple setups and things like this. You shoot the film from one point of view, one angle, and then go on to the next shot rather than having to cover the shots.
Yeah, no, go on.
No, I was going to say that I think one of the most interesting things about Hitchcock's films, and especially about this film, is that he's not only interested in the audience's experience of piecing together fragments in order to come up with a conclusion, but it's something he works out on a plot level, where he has characters in the film who are trying to gather clues together and piece together information, so that you as an audience member get to see characters in the film who are trying to figure out what's going on, and you experience the world very often as they do. Through their eyes, trying to figure out what's happening in the film.
You know, that kind of brings up a key aspect about Hitchcock to me, and that's Hitchcock's modernity. That is, on the one hand, for a lot of people when they've just seen this film, they might say, so what's the big deal? This is a very, very well-made film, okay? But the big deal is that in 1934, people were not combining the aesthetics of German Expressionism and the Soviet montage in the ways in which it's commonly done today. I mean, in some sense, he's setting a pattern for doing that sense of fragmentation, the sense of the use of subjective camera for the German Expressionism, and that is something that that made the film in its own time seem extraordinarily modern, but is also one of the reasons I think, at least at a stylistic level, why we're still so comfortable with this film over 50 years later. It sets a kind of model that has been imitated by countless people and still seems quite fresh. But it's also modern in a whole host of other ways. I was thinking you were chatting, a little bit earlier, not on the show, but before the show, about this whole notion of the multi-layering of Hitchcock. That in one sense you can say, some people can say, oh, well, this is just a good adventure film. There's a lot of other things going on here. I mean, for example, Roy.
One thing, my immediate reaction is, to a certain extent, thank God it isn't a modern film, because so much of what is being shot today in all countries is being ground out in a very conventional invisible editing, strictly subordinated to narrative type of style. Whereas here, what's going on, of course, is something that in many ways is a lot better. Certainly this film, I think in most people's opinions, I think Janet would agree, is much better than the 1955 or 56 remake with Doris Day and Jimmy Stewart. You mentioned the multi-layering. This is so typical of Hitchcock, is that his good guys are really bad guys beneath the skin. And so in this film, when the husband puts on the dentist uniform and takes over and has the bad guy in the chair, narratively, he's still the good guy, but visually, he has the appearance of the bad guy, just as Cary Grant does, holding the knife over the dead body of the slain diplomat in North by Northwest. Raymond Ballure has done a long article on just how North by Northwest is an almost purely Oedipal film, and this visual of Cary Grant holding the knife over the dead body of the dead, quote, father, unquote, is a classic example of how Hitchcock very often says one thing visually and another thing narratively.
Well,
That idea that there's a sort of dark side to all of us is something that I think he likes to carry out in a lot of his films, films like Psycho, films like Strangers on a Train. I think one of the things that's fun about this film is the way he explores the dark side of an apparently conventional British family. And in particular, I find the early sections of the film where the family is expressing a certain amount of desire to get rid of the daughter. You know, there's a lot of fun in that. The family is sort of joking about this daughter who keeps interrupting events. You know, the daughter ruins the ski jump. The daughter ruins the mother's attempt to win the skeet shooting championship. And you know, you have this feeling that everybody in some surface joking way wants to get rid of her, but then events in the film transpire so that that idea gets literalized, and she really does disappear, and the family then has to confront the reality of having, you know, how they feel about having their daughter kidnapped and what to do about it.
And of course the same thing with the banter that goes back and forth with the wife and Louis Bernard. They act very much as if they're having an affair, and of course it's all done in a very bantering style, and they're acting that they're acting that they're acting that they're acting, and the husband pretends to cry about it. But of course the husband, by attaching the piece of loose yarn to the back of Louis Bernard's coat, directly leads to Louis Bernard's being shot. And this again becomes the classic Hitchcock visualization of wish fulfillment. On the one hand, it's innocent banter, it's narratively inoffensive, it doesn't make the husband into a villain, but visually again, and beneath the surface of all of this, he definitely is getting rid of his wife's either lover or potential lover,
well, the other thing
who was a handsome Frenchman, by the way.
Well, the other thing I was thinking about is, of course, in the first sections of the film, they're pretending as if they're acting. I mean, there's all this play acting that's going on, and that's something that's allowed within the bourgeois family. I mean, it's nice. It's a little bit, you know, gives a little bit of fun to the range in some way or another. And then in the second, I'd say you say 2/3 of the film, we have alternative protagonists. I mean, first of all, the husband takes over the action, so to speak, in looking, you know, and tracking things down, and then the wife takes over, and of course resolves it. So then they're put in this situation of having really to go. I mean, you know, they've been pretending as if we like to act in this way and that way, and then they get to take over from there.
Well, I think one of the nice things about the film is that on the surface, these characters seem to be so unsentimental and so unconventional, and they don't act as if they have traditional family relationships. But what happens is that as the film proceeds, you discover that there's a reality in terms of their commitment to each other and the depth of their feelings to one another that gets demonstrated by their experience with danger, so that we discover how close they are and how much they care about each other without their having to talk about it. And so that we get this fun surface, but then what happens over the course of the film proves their mettle and proves their strength as characters. And one of the ways in which I think Hitchcock pursues that issue is by having them then perform in a different way. It's no longer that they're putting on an act of casualness. Now they really do have to put on very convincing performances. The mother has to finally, at the end of the film, show that even with a lot of people standing around staring at her, even with her daughter on a rooftop and a sharpshooter nearby, that she is capable of completing the performance, of going on. Yes, absolutely. The game has become serious, and this thing that she said at the beginning about waiting for that moment when they could have another try at it and redo the competition gets realized at the end of the film, and she shows herself to be an adequate performer.
Well, this, of course, is one of the large differences with the American film. On the one hand, you do have the classic Hitchcock theme of the eruption of the irrational into the rational, but this American family that's established in the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much is the only film that Hitchcock, of his own, that Hitchcock ever remade. I mean, The 39 Steps was remade at least twice, but not by Hitchcock.
But not by Hitchcock.
You have There's no suggestion of Doris Day's being attracted by the Louis Bernard character. The little boy is a totally apple pie cheese whiz type of American kid, totally obnoxious in his simpering little wisecracks. But there's a total devotion to the kid, a total very American devotion to the family, and they don't play around with it. So it's very different and somehow not quite as fulfilling because the American family is, I think, taken just a tad too seriously.
I have an idea, Que Sera Sera is not your favorite song.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I always turn the volume down if I'm watching a tape of it with that.
But you know, it's interesting because one of the things that happens in this film is that you get to see the sinister side of the family, the dark side of the family in certain ways, but you also get to see the elegant side of the villain. And
yes.
that's you know, there's this wonderful performance by Peter Lorre who has a kind of elegance and grace at the same time he's villainous that, you know, makes us see a different side of him too. He's the one who's so concerned about observing propriety, and I think he has a wonderful line where he talks about the fact that the composer would be happy with his plan for the assassination because it wouldn't interrupt anyone.
Yes, yes.
Now you could go right on listening to the music.
Classic Hitchcock villain. Hitchcock loves suave, debonair villains. Whether in Saboteur, he's a rich man out on a ranch, and of course in North by Northwest we have James Mason,
who can be suaver,
who is much more enticing than Leo G. Carroll as the professor. Leo G. Carroll's wonderful, and as a matter of fact, he's the actor who, besides Hitchcock himself, who appeared in the most Hitchcock films. But James Mason, just with this, as he has Cary Grant there trying to get information that, of course, poor Cary Grant doesn't have, is terribly concerned about having to go through all of this dirty business. And my favorite line out of North by Northwest is when James Mason sits there and says, "Games, must we?" And perfect Hitchcock
Or the
villain.
thing with the gun in this film where he picks up the gun and announces that it's too dangerous and has to move it to another place, or expresses concern about whether people are dropping matches on the floor of the church and that sort of thing. You know, that terribly elegant concern for decorum.
Well, there's an interesting way in which Hitchcock always plays with traditional values. I mean, we come back to the family here, and he ends up affirming the family in the end. I mean, these people managed to stick together and they managed to perform under a situation of incredible stress. But it's not as if this is a Victorian family in the end. I mean, this is a family that affirms a set of values, but they're values that are readjusted to an extraordinarily ambivalent, threatening kind of modern world.
I think Hitchcock really touches on the ambivalence that parents feel about their children and that husbands and wives feel for each other. And it's the sort of role that is assumed by Bruno in Strangers on a Train when, you know, you say something in a joking way and then you have a person who takes you literally. And then, you know, there's a sort of testing of just how seriously you meant what you said. And here I think, you know, we get to see a lot of the ambivalence that we all feel dealt with in the film. And ultimately overcome, I suppose.
I think that, again, the ending, unlike the ending of the remake, the ending of this film is not quite as pro-family as again, it might seem. Certainly with the wife has, her first concern ultimately seems to be to win the shooting contest. And she has finally asserted her superiority by the end of the film. And this brings us into another point which I think is very important about this film, and that is that Hitchcock's British films and his early American films are very much oriented towards the female, towards the heroine, and take a lot of things from the heroine's point of view, while in the remake, Doris Day is down on the lounge screaming out "Que sera, sera," and Jimmy Stewart's doing all the dirty work. Here, the last piece of dirty work and the real piece of skill is done by the woman. And if you even look at Rebecca, Shadow of a Doubt, Suspicion, and up to Notorious, which I think is the turning point, Hitchcock's emphasis early on is very much in favor of the woman, a woman who is still somewhat the victim of a sexist society, but to whom Hitchcock gives more of a chance than he does once Cary Grant punches out Ingrid Bergman's lights in Notorious.
Yeah, okay. And I think of The Lady Vanishes along those lines, where you have the woman who has witnessed something that's of great significance. No one will believe it. And the immediate cause is because you got bumped on the head, so therefore people think. But the second and underlying cause that everybody knows is that this is an English lady on vacation, and after all, we don't take them that seriously. But in fact, Hitchcock's point is you should take her very, very seriously in this.
I think one of the most important sequences in the film in terms of establishing this idea is the Albert Hall sequence, where you literally see that whole sequence through the eyes of Jill as she sits there trying to piece together information. You get these extended point of view sequences where over and over again you identify with this woman who's trying to figure out what's happening and what to do about it.
I think it's good at this point just to insert you know, one of those trivia, quantitative sort of things, that the scene is made up of something like 90 shots, which is an extraordinary amount of information to sort through in the amount of time given, and it comes back to your point about piecing together those fragments.
And not only piecing them together, but literally forcing you to identify with the experience of this woman who I think is presented to us fairly coolly in the beginning. She's really she's kind of a tough cookie. She's got a thin veneer of not caring, of being a little bit glib, and then when we actually get into a sequence like the Albert Hall sequence, we are allowed to suddenly feel what she feels. And I think, especially when he's dealing with this very British woman, it becomes necessary for us to get inside her a little bit. And he does it in the Albert Hall sequence. He also does it when she faints in the film, when she discovers that her child has been kidnapped. All of a sudden, he brings to bear a great deal of sort of subjective camera work where you suddenly see the room spinning, superimposed over her face, and you experience the faint along with her. It's a kind of nice balance to a character who's otherwise presented to us in very exterior terms, who seems to be a person who cares a lot about performance and show, and not someone who reveals herself otherwise.
Yeah, the Albert Hall sequence, of course, is perhaps the great sequence in the remake, and there's a funny story about that because it's told by Jimmy Stewart. The scene as it was originally shot, the sequence as it was originally shot, was done with dialogue. And in the remake, Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day are both present. And Hitchcock said, well, I can't handle all of this dialogue. I can't hear my symphony. Don't say anything. And so the Albert Hall sequence as it comes across now in the remake looks very much like something out of a silent film. They're gesturing and they're all of these practically all of these exaggerated gestures. It looks very much like a silent film, complete with music, as a matter of fact. Of course, the Storm Cloud Cantata, which is the same piece we hear in the original version, is going along. We're even seeing the notes move along. The camera's following the notes along the page, and the composer of the rest of the music, Bernard Herrmann, is standing up there conducting it, and everything is done very much in a silent film style, and as Jimmy Stewart tells the story at the end, and Hitchcock liked it very much because he was now able to hear his symphony.
Well, isn't that just sort of true of Hitchcock in general?
Yes.
Wouldn't he always prefer something visual rather than counting on the dialogue? That opening sequence of the film where people are just sort of murmuring and muttering and gasping, you know, and you keep being faced with a lot of visual information, and that's the primary basis that you have for interpreting that.
The opening of The Original Man Who Knew Too Much is a wonderful piece of montage with the close-up of the frightened face, the very long shot of the man coming down the hill. Interestingly, if you go out and try to rent a video cassette of this, a lot of the unfortunately, this film is in public domain, and anybody who feels like bringing out a video cassette of it can so do. And when my students have tried to rent the video cassette of this whole opening sequence, which is a classic piece of Hitchcock montage, is missing. I mean, there ought to be a law, and unfortunately there isn't. But besides everything else, Hitchcock visually brings in another very important theme in his films, and that's the accidental crossing of paths. Here, it's a very dramatic crossing of paths. All the way at the end of his career in Family Plot, there's a wonderful shot where we see Bruce Dern and
Barbara Harris.
Thank you, Barbara Harris, driving along in the car, and they pass an intersection, and then Karen Black goes horizontally in the other direction. Again, this crossing of paths. At that point, they don't even meet, but we know that further on in the film, these two stories are going to come together. This accidental crossing of paths that we have here, and which is handled very much in the montage, brings together the elements of chance and fate and gets us away from this sort of middle-of-the-road cause and effect psychology that is so much a part of ordinary cinema.
It also gets us along with that characteristic narrative strategy of Hitchcock. There's the colliding of two storylines that in many ways don't seem as if they should have ever collided, but one of the things that happens in modern life is these things come together. I mean, the most famous example, of course, being the embezzling plot in Psycho and Norman Bates' unfortunate habits in running his motel, and they're not supposed to have anything to do with one another, yet I hope I'm not shocking anyone in our audience. Someone in the shower finds out that they have an unfortunate intersection. Yeah. Well, that brings me. Oh no, please,
I'm
Jen.
sorry.
No, go on, Jen.
No, I was going to say it's the central image in Strangers on a Train, that idea of the crisscross and seeing the train tracks as they cross, as Bruno and Guy meet for the first time on the train by accident, by chance.
And isn't it Bruno who says, "Oh, and Guy, I have a wonderful theory of crisscross murders."
Yes.
Couldn't I
Right.
tell you?
I'll do your murder and you'll do mine.
Sure, Bruno. Sure, Bruno. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
And in North by Northwest, when, of course, it gets us into The Wrong Man, which is one of the classic Hitchcock themes
Right.
in North by Northwest, but this non-existent George Kaplan is paged at the same time that Cary Grant, Roger Thornhill, Oedipal figure that he is calling the page over to send a telegram to his mother.
In the bar at the Plaza.
In the bar
all
at the Plaza.
All New Yorkers should recognize.
Yes, and all of a sudden, the coincidence of these two gestures and the pan, I think, left to the two heavies brings these two stories together.
Yeah. Let's talk about endings just for a second. So we've talked about how he does things. With storylines and substituting collisions of storylines, one of the things that's interesting about Hitchcock is that the stories get wrapped up, but they don't get wrapped up. Okay? You might say that if you really wanted to believe in very, very hard that things got resolved and wanted to make yourself conscientiously naive about the film, you could believe that things get wrapped up. But if you're going to avoid conscientious naivete, there's a whole way in which he ends up with ambivalences at the end.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, let's just take three quick examples.
Okay.
Let's take Saboteur, in which the villain has just fallen from the Statue of Liberty, and poor Robert Cummings is there. We don't know, we don't have any idea. There's no denouement or anything tacked onto the film. Vertigo, with poor Jimmy Stewart standing at the top of San Juan Bautista.
He was cured all right. Yeah, he can now
Boy,
stand and
isn't
look
it nice for him? And what about that murderer? Whatever happened to him? Did he go free?
Well, it's interesting because there was originally at the end of Vertigo a sequence that was shot with Jimmy Stewart and the Barbara Bel Geddes character talking and hearing on the radio that Gavin Elster, who had started this whole scheme going, had in fact been caught. It was sort of like the endings that he would always put onto his Hitchcock Presents TV programs. Thank God they didn't put that little piece of business in the film.
Since we're having favorite endings right now, no, my favorite ending is Psycho, when they drag in the psychologist who gives this, pat little psychology.
Self-righteous as hell.
Yeah, Psychology 101 explanation. Well, if you only understood these big-name psychological terms, you'd understand this poor young man, et cetera, et cetera.
But why was he dressed like that? What was he, a transvestite or something?
Yes and no.
Yes and no, right, exactly.
And then the last one, of course, we have is the car being dragged up out of the swamp. Superimposed are about 2 or 3 frames
of the skull,
of the mummified Mrs. Bates' mummified face.
Right.
But
so that doesn't kind of help us go to sleep that evening at all, does it?
Don't you think a lot of this has to do with that whole thing in Hitchcock's films of not wanting you to ever feel that you can trust your perceptions of anything, that you can really understand the world around you, that in fact you could be off in Switzerland on a vacation and chaos could disrupt your life at any time?
Well, let's go back just for a moment to German expressions. No, because that's one of the things that he inherits from it, is the way in which in expressionism there's this sense that things are never quite right, or to use the phrase they use in the English translation, there's a sense of not at homeness. Just when you thought things were under control, the environment was ordered in a whole set of ways, things you find out are unarranged. I mean, or there's a whole aspect, there are systems operating in the world that you'd never really even suspected in some way. And so nice Swiss vacations.
Yeah, I think that's why the opening is so chilling, that you have those nice travel brochures that introduce you to this idea of going to Switzerland, and the next thing you know, a little dog leaps out of someone's arms, and it's all gone crazy. It's almost as if at any moment the world can be thoroughly disturbed. And you feel that way all the time in his films, that somehow you can never locate evil in any one person.
Oh,
it's just everywhere.
So, no. There's that sense in which, even though we know the particular object sometimes of suspense, and we know at some point, this is the murderer and he may pop up, something like that, there's a whole other way in which we don't know very much about what the site, what the locus of the evil is going to be. I mean, is it going to be a domestic object? Somehow there's the famous Alfred Hitchcock's Presents episode in which the wife kills her husband with a frozen leg of lamb.
And then serves it to the policemen who have come to investigate the murder.
Right, and they keep looking for that blunt object, the heavy blunt object that served to murder the husband, and they keep the delicious lamb that's constantly served to these gentlemen.
Yeah. Well, not only this, but of course Hitchcock goes, particularly in his American films, one step further and definitely sets up an average American family type of situation, certainly in Shadow of a Doubt, with which was, a lot of which was filmed on location in Santa Rosa, California. One thing that is so frightening about the film is that it all takes place in such totally homey surroundings, or in a slightly different context, a film like Vertigo, in which he added the very...
We're going to have to leave you now in those slightly homey environs in California, and we're going to have to leave our audience in a moment or so in those environs because we've come to the end of our time. If you're interested by what we've said and you'd like to know more about cinema studies or about this program, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to this address. Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give that information to you again. Please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion that you enjoy. Thanks. Welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island. Today we'll be seeing Frank Capra's classic, Meet John Doe. Starring Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck, this political drama summarizes a number of the themes of Capra's films, both that precede and, in fact, that follow it. We'll be talking about that and a host of other things after the film. Our guests today are going to be Professor Morris Dickstein from Queens College and President Edmund Volpe of the College of Staten Island. I hope you enjoy Meet John Doe. Point two. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. Tonight we have two guests, and I'd like to introduce them to you right now. My first guest is President Edmund Volpe of the College of Staten Island. Before President Volpe took his presidential robes, he had a career, still has it, keeps up with these things, as a scholar of modern American literature. His A Reader's Guide to Faulkner has in fact been in print over 20 years, still keeps rolling off the presses, and he still keeps his hand in all of these matters aside from all the other things that a president has to do. My other guest is Professor Morris Dickstein of Queens College. He's a member of the English department at Queens College, but he's also part of the consortium of film faculty at Queens. He's published widely, both in literature and in film, is editor of major film directors, and has been working recently on a book on America in the 1930s, which will include a chapter on Frank Capra. I think that's already in print, as a matter of fact. Well, it might be a good place to start just with the fact that this is a film very much from the American 1930s. Ed, if you might, could you, just give us a little bit of context from what's going on, in the other arts, but also what's going on in the United States at this period?
Well, what struck me about the film as I watched it again after many years was the continuity in Frank Capra's vision and the vision of so many of the American writers of that period. Yeah. There has been an idealism that I think has characterized American literature and American writers, an idealism that has been subjected to intense criticism by most of our writers. What you have in Capra, I think, is that very positive strain, the vision of what America can be, the vision of the small man, something that Carl Sandburg was able to express in a magnificent poetic fashion in The People, Yes, or even the vision of a Walt Whitman, which is a very positive vision about the United States and its people. So I think there is, what struck me was that continuity. Here we have a director working out of Hollywood with roots that seem to be in the literary tradition, the cultural tradition of America.
Yeah. We might stop just for a second, I was thinking, Morris, and talk about how this comes about biographically for Capra. I mean, his background itself is really quite interesting, how he hooks into this.
Yes, it's interesting that the greatest upholders of the American dream in the 20th century have usually turned out to be immigrants. He himself was born in 1897 in Sicily. He came over with his family when he was 6 years old. He eventually became the first of his family ever to attend college. He studied engineering and gradually sort of slid into the technical side of film. And the first films he directed were with the Senate and Hal Roach studios, the comedy studios in the 1920s. He's the one who at least took some claims for creating the screen personality of Harry Langdon. Oh, yeah. And in retrospect, you can see that the simple character, the simple innocent character played by Langdon in the few good films he made in the 1920s were a forerunner of the sort of common man hero that you get in the more true Capra films of the 1930s and 1940s.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We also, in the visual arts at this time, I mean, obviously we have the commissions of the federal government themselves, but after some of the hermetic strain of modernism, in the 20s we open up into these public murals, a great era of public works, of public vision of America and itself, reaffirming a whole host of things challenged by the Depression. And I think his pictures almost have that feel of being a kind of great mural of the common man about them. It's
a good point. You bring to mind the great murals of the NRA days when they really put artists to work. The government was trying to support the artists, and they have a very distinct style, which is almost the fabulistic quality that you're getting in a Capra film. It's a very good point.
Yeah, that kind of brings us to Frank Capra and fairy tale.
Yes, it's not exactly clear, though, how Capra came to this common man figure, because although it's there in the personality of Harry Langdon, if you look at his films of the early 1930s, certainly Clark Gable, and It Happened One Night, is not exactly the common man, though he has a common touch. And his first political film, before the better-known ones of the late 30s, is a film of 1932 about the bank failures called American Madness. And there you have Walter Brennan, and the hero is a bank president, not exactly the common man either, though it's based on a well-known bank figure in California of the time who did sort of have the common touch. But it was only in Mr. Deeds Goes to Town in 1936 that Capra really settled on that common man figure for good.
Now that comes after the remarkable success of the screwball comedy. It happened one night. So it's almost as if that success allowed him, I mean, would you say, to bring forth this? Because there's a remarkable consistency in the films that come from after it happened one night of the next 4 or 5, I mean, throughout the rest of the films he makes, but that really clustering of 4, 5, 6 films that issue in the next 10 to 12 years or so.
Well, he gives a very interesting account of this in his autobiography, a book called The Name Above the Title. And It Happened One Night was the first, and until recently, the only film ever to sweep all the major Academy Awards. And he describes having gone into a real funk after that success and having had the equivalent of a nervous breakdown, and then going to see a kind of quasi-therapy figure, sort of mysterious figure, who then tells him, are you going to just lie in this slough of despond, or you're going to pull yourself up and do something about it? And in a number of his subsequent films, he has a scene like that where the hero goes through a sort of emotional crisis, which is often compared to Jesus on the cross, and then manages somehow to recapture his energy and vitality and to give the film some kind of positive ending. Sometimes he had difficulty, as in this film, arriving at that positive ending, but that became the prototype. I think it was the experience of having himself gone through an emotional crisis that he was unprepared for that gave him the additional psychological depth that he hadn't really had in any of his earlier films.
Yeah, and of course it's a crisis brought on, ironically, by characters who get success. I mean, the crisis comes in a moment in which they're successful, and then say, well, what does this mean? I mean, after all, we are now successful in America. What do you do with it, since the culture seems to be so much set up for striving towards as opposed to getting something? There's a wonderful line in Michael Ritchie's film, The Candidate, and after which the candidate has won his election, and at the end of the film, the last line is, so what do I do now? And it's almost as if that crisis, these films chronicle the moment in which somebody gets it. You get it, and then the film works out that set of crises that are going to come through.
Well, what actually happens in these films, though, is not so much a crisis of dealing with success, but a parable, and here we get to the fairy tale element, of the lone individual, the common man, up against forces which are very similar to a kind of Marxist or left-wing description of America in the 1930s, of trusts, of monopolies, of forces that control banks and newspapers and so on. And the fairy tale is usually that of the innocent and often quite ignorant individual, but with kind of helpings of idealism and Native American strength and fortitude, up against all of those forces which at first overwhelm him, but gradually somehow he's able to go through this crisis and through a kind of catharsis in which he is pilloried by these forces, and somehow, though it becomes more and more difficult from film to film, able to manage to defeat them in the course of the film. So that is the emotional crisis tends to be a crisis that begins, starting with Mr. Deeds, to overlap with the political situation in the United States, with an analysis of the role of the common man in a society in which the forces of democracy seem readily subject to manipulation by these oligarchical and monopolistic forces.
Yeah. There's also the world situation that's coming to play, and especially in this film, where you have the figure with his motor troops.
Yes, stormtroopers.
Oh, yes, it's really very, very dark in its vision that way, and also visually there are, clear echoes that are popular. We talk about Capra as a populist filmmaker. Well, one of the things that we have to consider in that regard is that he's making films for people who have seen certain kinds of visual materials. So if you go, as the average American did in the 30s and the 40s, if you go to the movie theater, you see the newsreels, one of the things you're going to be seeing is newsreel footage of the Nazi rallies. You're going to be seeing footage of Mussolini. You're going to be seeing footage of May 1st Red Square things. And when you see that private motorcycle corps, you get an immediate echo. Wait a minute. We know it was these other guys who had this sort of thing. What is this going on in our own backyard?
I wouldn't call him a political director in that sense. I think the echoes are very much there, But his battle, the oppositions are fundamentally moral, the good and the evil. And they are projected, those forces of good and evil are projected in social terms. The innocent American with the hope that he's going to get along with everyone, that happiness is at the end of the road, against the forces which, again, in terms, economic terms, the capitalistic forces, the rich people become the powerful and the villainous. So that you have, I think, much more a social and a moral texture in his vision and what you see in the films. We had the wonderful opportunity of having Frank Capra stay with us for 2.5 days in 1978 when we gave him an honorary degree. And I carry away from those 2.5 days many wonderful memories, his voice still clear and ringing, sitting at the kitchen table and talking, his wife Lou, a real affection existing between them after many years of marriage. And what you see in the films is Frank Capra. The personality he was able to project, that whole sense of destiny, of himself, of his part in the American experience, in the American scene. He spoke as he directed, and that was a rich, rich experience.
Well, that brings up a really interesting point about there weren't many directors who explicitly were allowed to address or inform an audience with their personality in the 30s. Now, people now argue, I think appropriately, I think you probably agree, that a John Ford was always his own man, or a Howard Hawks, or whatever, but Capra has a kind of special history in that way in his dealings with the studios.
Well, before the sound era, the only ones who were really able to do that were the great comedy directors like Chaplin and Keaton, who not only mostly directed their own films, but also played themselves, and therefore they were able to incarnate themselves right on the screen. And Chaplin certainly, and Keaton in other ways, gives us a foreigner of that kind of common man figure in a quite different sense. I think that the key to Capra's success and being able to put his stamp on his films was not simply that he was very good and commercially very successful from the very beginning, but that he worked at a studio, Columbia, which at that time was a very small backstreet studio run by a man by the name of Harry Cohn. And Capra directed many forgotten films, films that are forgotten today for Columbia before he had the great success with It Happened One Night. But it was precisely that he didn't work at a studio like MGM, which was controlled by a tyrant like Louis Mayer, that enabled Capra to put both the studio on the map and also to assume for himself the kind of control over the films that was impossible in a huge film factory like MGM.
Yeah, so that considering what Columbia Pictures is today, or the reputation it has, what we're essentially doing is recovering the fact that he put them on the map, that Frank Capra and the excellence of Columbia Pictures were synonymous for a period of time.
Now, eventually, after 12 years or so, there was a parting of the ways, and Meet John Doe was actually the first film that he made after he broke with Columbia, and it was his first independent production, though he was able to use many of the same actors like Gary Cooper and the screenwriter Robert Riskin, whom he'd used before at Columbia. But this was very much of a chancy economic thing for Capra to go off on his own. He invested in a bank, he mortgaged his house, went off, invested all of his own money and so on, which left all of Hollywood, independent production was a much more rare thing at the time than it is today. And everyone was watching to see whether this would succeed or whether Capra would fall on his face, as the studios, I think, hoped that he would.
And well, we might talk just a little bit about what did happen to this film. First of all, it was a troubled film in the script. I mean, I think that shows up in some ways in the completed film, not ways that are unpleasing necessarily. What about the ending of this film, gentlemen? I mean, it is quite an ending.
The one you see.
The one you see is not very satisfying.
Yeah, in some sense, that's the point. It isn't satisfying. It isn't. I think the New York Times, whenever they have to say something about it, they keep saying he should have jumped. Is the
He should have jumped.
Well, he did in one version, I understand.
There were apparently 4 separate other endings that circulated before he actually got the whole cast back and filmed this final ending. And this is when someone wrote to him that said, really, the John Does of the other world would be the only ones that could convince him not to jump. And so he assembled the John Does, and they convinced him not to jump. And I think the ending is appropriate in one sense. When D.B. Norton says to him at the end, you know, it's futile, you know, we're just going to bury you in Potter's Field, you know, your gesture will be meaningless. And then when Ann Mitchell appeals to him, no, don't jump, don't jump, the truth is that they have him over a barrel. The point is that this is a very dark film. It's a film in which the common man hero has the least understanding of what he's doing, has the least power against these large, almost fascistic forces. And by the end, and Capra does not really retract that. You know, in the previous film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart doesn't really succeed at the end either. It's only that Claude Rains has a change of heart and tries to kill himself, that after Mr. Smith has completely failed, suddenly there's a sort of deus ex machina, and he is vindicated at the end. But here it's even worse because they really have him over a barrel. Whether he jumps or doesn't jump, it's pointless. He's been exposed. He's the people that he put his faith and hope in, all the John Does of the world, have turned upon him. They've proved to be fickle. They've proved that they're easily manipulated by the D.B. Nortons of the world. And therefore, it's a relatively meaningless gesture. And the truth is that the ending is therefore true to the film itself, because at the end of the film, there's really nothing more for him to do. He has really lost it.
Yeah. Well, the ending of this film is very interesting in the context of other Hollywood films of the period, because one of the things that's most characteristic of them is film scholars have done a lot of work on, and I think everybody just knows intuitively that you get a clear-cut ending. You either have a triumph of one thing or another. This film seems to leave a whole set of questions open. I mean, he's not. I don't know if he's completely defeated. I mean, at least the people are back with the common people. I guess what I'm moving towards is a notion that the ending is mixed.
Well, if you accept a thematic ending here, I see the last scene as a kind of reverse pietà, where the Christ figure is holding the mother or the woman who has saved him. And you do have the meek shall inherit the earth theme starting very early in the picture, right. So that there is a continuity and perhaps a logical conclusion when you have that kind of an ending. I think probably that's what he was depending upon when he decided this would be the ending.
But visually, it's very dark, it's very muted, and in a sense, the culmination cinematically of the film is really the convention scene, which looks so funereal, and where he goes through his crucifixion, his you know, and this is the equivalent, I think, in Mr. Smith of the crucifixion of Jimmy Stewart on the floor of the Senate, and that's the emotional culmination of the film, and the little bit of a happy ending that's tacked on is sort of something like the kind of thing that you get in a Dickens novel like Little Dorrit, a very muted and happy ending for which no claims are really made in terms of overthrowing the kinds of forces that you've seen, the darker forces that you've seen at work in the course of the film.
Right. Just to draw an analogy with another artist, that turns out to be, in a number of films, one of Hitchcock's strategies as well. The falsely
happy ending that's not really very happy, like the ending of Suspicion or a film like that.
Right. I was also thinking of the ending of Psycho, where we have a psychiatrist come in and give a truly preposterous explanation for the whole set of things.
Sort of self-exploding Hollywood-style ending.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Don't blame Hollywood. The Greeks did it too. It goes way back.
They named it.
That brings us, Greeks is a good, kind of transition over to the fact that these characters have a kind of psychology, but they're not really, I mean, the kinds of characters of significant psychological depth that we associate with the rise of the psychological novel in the 19th and 20th century, these aren't those kinds of characters. But I think they're rich characters still.
Well, they are richer, I think, than some of the characters in Capra's other pictures, which are flatter and more representative of good, of evil. simpler people.
Right.
I don't think that though the hero, John Doe, is simple-minded in many ways, there are forces working there, and he wants money. He's not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He's not one of those that are going to inherit the earth automatically. He's got to get money to fix his elbow. So that, and you have within the heroine, her own greed, her desires, her ambitions, mixed with her desire to take care of her mother and her children, her love of her father, the gentle, good person. And so they're complicated characters.
Yeah, I guess one of the things I was going after, since people are always going after things with questions or asking of topics, is we begin with something you talked about a little bit earlier. We begin with almost a mythological type, particularly within an American context. We begin with the baseball player, the American sport. We begin with a prototype of the 30s film, at least, the American career woman, that pops up again and again and is a very strong character through that. And he and Riskin, they put twists on these matters. They begin with the recognizable character type, and then from there, I mean, are baseball players supposed to need money for operations? I mean,
well, in the Depression, perhaps, yeah. It's there you get the social theme, and Capra does tend to work with types, and which of course fits into he's a great user of like Preston Sturges, of Hollywood character actors.
Oh, absolutely.
Whom he picks really not for their psychological complexity, obviously, but for their voices and their faces. Graham Greene, in one of his film reviews, said that Capra is on the level of the great Russians in the way he contemplates the human face. And the thing that I think that makes this more complex is that Capra's cinema is really a cinema of ideas, even though the ideas may not be very complex, but the number of viewpoints he gives you on these ideas makes it complex. In the ordinary fairy tale, you would have just the characters of good and evil. In Capra's films, you tend to have at least a triple structure. You have the evil characters, often personified by someone like Edward Arnold. Then you have the good characters, personified usually by the mothers and fathers or by the common man hero. But always in between, you have basically these hard-shelled, hard-boiled, cynical characters who are redeemable and who help to redeem and save and wise up the common man hero, who is good but who is ignorant of the way the world really works. And in this film, it's Anne Mitchell, played by Barbara Stanwyck, and it's Cannell, played by James Gleason, extremely well. And the classic Capra scene, absolutely classic Capra scene, is when Cannell tells him what's in the speech that he's about to give the following night. And Capra was at his best in giving you his sentimental and patriotic values, not directly, but in a barroom scene like that where a guy is sloshy drunk and you're seeing under the surface of this hard-boiled, cynical character, and he is in the process of recovering some kind of buried idealism or belief in America or moral goodness that you never noticed in that character until that point, or you barely glinted in that character. And so you have a mutual redemption. This character in the middle clues in the good character who is in the process of being crucified, and he in turn has been the agent of redemption for that character who otherwise was too wised up and too cynical to ever accept any of the ideals that the film's more or less ambivalently based on.
There's another level that I would add in your structure, and that's represented by his friend. Is it the Colonel?
Colonel,
sure.
Yes.
That is particularly interesting to me because I don't think it's in the other Capra films that I can remember.
Yeah,
here you have a plea for the open road, for absolute freedom, that if you get caught up in any way with a woman, with a job, with desire for money, with need for money, then your freedom is going to go. And there's a wonderful scene during the radio speech when the Colonel is at the door and he keeps moving it and back and forth. You can go out, you can free yourself, you're not trapped yet. And of course he represents that throughout.
There's a very interesting aspect also to him, because I think most people are unfamiliar with the word helot until they come to this film. And as much as he represents this potential freedom, there's also something enigmatic about it. Forceful, expressive, but enigmatic. And people say, what? You know, when he says something like that. And that brings us to the distinctly American language of this kind of film. I mean, its clip of its dialogue the particular, the diction of the characters, the kind of vocabulary they have, strikes me as bringing this American English very strongly to the forefront, is one of the definitions of our culture.
Well, this is one of the things that Capra loved in Riskin's screenplays and why he used him. And though you find it just as well in other screenplays of his, the previous film, Mr. Smith, had been written by someone else, Sidney Buckman, and it has exactly that same quality. So it's clearly Capra that must have been in many ways responsible for it. But I think it's very important, the role of the Colonel, because it does give the film that additional complexity that the other Capra films don't have. And I think one of the reasons for that is that Capra was extremely sensitive that what he calls the intellectual critics had made fun of his films all through the 30s, that although they were generally critically successful and very successful commercially, they were made fun of for their simplicities and their sentimentalities and their so-called Capricorn. And I think the introduction of a figure like the Colonel, adding one additional layer of complexity to this cinema of ideas, Capra boasts in his autobiography that he really, for the first time, had won the approval of the intellectual critics, which he says he had very much desired. And other people have said, well, that's just what's wrong with this film, that he's begun to make films about themes rather than about people and so on. So there is a division of opinion about whether it was right for Capra to go for that greater complexity, though I think it works extremely well.
Yeah. Well, I was also thinking about the fact that the language which, when we read about how some of these American films, and Capra's not alone in this, but were received abroad. I mean, this sense of American dialogue was something that excited a lot of people. The English novelist Elizabeth Bowen would say she would just go to the movies, not because she could ever write this sort of thing herself, because she was coming out of a very different tradition, but she just liked to hear this kind of speech. Well, one of the things that becomes interesting is that it may be new, it may be cynical, it may have a new power to it, but it also can be extraordinarily deceptive as well, because we see someone like the Anne Mitchell character who begins and is a journalist herself, has this command, and yet she gets herself into a lot of trouble with her command of
words.
And words.
But also because this is a film about deception and fraud, and in many ways it's also a film about acting and about putting on a performance, because this whole John Doe stunt, after all, is a promotional stunt,
right,
which relates to forces of manipulative capitalism and politics in America. But at the same time, what they do to John Doe early on is that they give him acting lessons. And at the end, when they expose him, they say, you're a fake, you've been putting on a performance, you've been paid for it. And when they appeal to John Doe not to run away, after he's run away, they appeal to him with much the same simplicities with which Capra appealed to his audience. And there is, I think, another layer on this film of the whole John Doe idea is, in a sense, Capra's relation to his own filmmaking and his own belief, and he was very aware of the criticism of his simple verities across the country, even though it was very much loved. And that dialogue, however, is very important, because beyond the level of characters symbolizing or representing one thing or another, that's the level at which you truly get the common man idea. That snap and crackle of the dialogue gives you the detailed, concrete version of precisely that faith in the Native American personality and of American values that Capra was dedicated to, though he, as we've said, also saw the darker side, the underside, and they became more important as his filmmaking proceeded.
Send up 5 hamburgers, 5 sodas, and 5 pieces of apple pie.
Right.
Well, what I've got to say at this point is that it's a good takeout order for us because we're going to have to go away right now. If you'd like more information about Cinema Then, Cinema Now, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me repeat that information for you, okay? If you'd like more information about this series or about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate, please send us a self-addressed stamped envelope at Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. I hope that our discussion of Frank Capra's Meet John Doe leads you to discussion and thought that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us.